everyone. Welcome to another live stream for History Valley podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Bart Ehrman, and today we'll be discussing his book, Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. So I wanted to start off with this. How do scholars discern from the various alleged quotations of Jesus in the New Testament from what Jesus actually said contained within the New Testament? Like, scholars debate this all the time. What did Jesus actually say? Because I know at the Jesus seminar, they concluded he didn't say most of the things that were attributed to him.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, it's a very important question. It's long been one of the central questions within the study of the New Testament. The difficulty is that we have different reports of his sayings in different gospels. Sometimes the two gospels report the same saying in different ways. And in some gospels, like in the Gospel of John, he talks about things completely different from what he talks about in the others. So one has to decide what did he probably say. Plus, we have gospels from outside the New Testament, and you have to figure out, well, did he say any of those things? And so what scholars do is they basically apply the same criteria they would apply to anybody trying to figure out what they really said. Today it's a bit easier because you have recordings, and so it's a little bit hard for a presidential candidate to say, "Yeah, I didn't say that." They have to say, "Yeah, I said it, but I didn't really mean it," or something like that. But with Jesus, you don't have that. And so how do you go about deciding? And the criteria you use typically for trying to understand anybody's sayings from the past would be things like, do you have sources that are independent of one another who are reporting him saying that thing or similar things to that? Do you have a lot of sources that say that's what he said, that didn't get it from each other? And you look at it and you say, well, if you do have things of Jesus that he didn't say, that must mean that somebody put them on his lips, like a later Christian wanted him to say something that he didn't say. And so if you've got sayings of Jesus that are perfectly lined up with what Christians wanted him to say, then it's a little bit hard to know whether he said it or not. You see what I mean? But if Jesus says something that seems to be contrary to what Christians would have wanted them to say, well, they didn't make that one up. So then you're pretty sure that, okay, those are ones that he probably said. You also look for things that are that make sense in his own historical and cultural context. And so if you've got sayings of Jesus that really don't fit into early first century Israel, then he probably didn't say it. I mean, and sometimes you actually look for anachronisms. For example, if you open a cookbook that says it was written in 1890, and the recipe tells you to stick something in your microwave, okay, yeah, this was not written in 1890, and so you look for, that's called an anachronism, where it's in the wrong time period. So that's the kind of thing you look for. Multiple sayings, independently attested. You look, especially just the ones that you're pretty sure he would have said would be ones that don't go along with what Christians would want to say. You've got to fit in the first century context, things like that.
And would an example of that be something like, would an example of something that a Christian would not have invented is from being a saying of Jesus, like sell your clothes and buy swords? Would that be a good example of that?
Well, that's a good question. It kind of depends how militarily oriented the particular Christian is. You may have some Christian who really believes in the revolution. And so, it's possible that that's put on his lips. But, given the fact that there's so many sayings of his that are more directed in precisely the opposite direction, you have to debate. And this is why scholars have these controversies, because some people think, well, that's more likely. Others think, well, that's more likely. And so you come up with the Jesus seminar making a list of sayings, most of which Jesus never said. And other scholars say, yeah, actually, I think he did say that one. But the two sorts thing, I would say that's probably, it seems, I don't know, it seems unlike what Jesus says elsewhere. Maybe followers of Jesus were more revolutionarily minded, especially in the early decades. I don't know. But so that would be a candidate for something that somebody probably put on his lips, I guess.
And what were the last words of Jesus, like what is most likely what Jesus what what was most likely his last words? And the reason I put it that way is because, like, I mean, as you know, the four gospels don't agree with each other about what Jesus supposedly said, what his last words supposedly were.
Yeah.
So do we just are we supposed to just default to what Mark says, or is there additional criteria that's utilized to try to sort out which
Yeah.
one of them is authentic?
Well, the argument for defaulting to Mark, I guess, would be because it's the earliest account. But it doesn't strike me that that's a very convincing argument, because even though Mark is the earliest, he's still 40 years later, being written by somebody who didn't know Jesus and wasn't there, and probably didn't know anybody who knew Jesus. So he's writing in a different language and living in a different part of the world. And so it's not a great source for something like this, because it's very problematic. I mean, the last words of Jesus would be the last things he says on the cross. Well, how many of his followers were there? In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there weren't any. In John, you have Jesus' mother and the beloved disciple, but people have doubted whether that's accurate. And so there's no way recording these things. My sense is we have no idea what Jesus said at the end. We don't know. And so it's one of these things where you get the Gospels report different things. You're right about that. And it's very important when you're trying to understand this kind of question that you look at each gospel carefully and see what it says and see how it differs from each of the other gospels. And you look to see if there's anything in these sayings that seems to line up carefully with this particular gospel's. In other words, you can make a really good case that Mark's cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me, fits perfectly well with the agenda otherwise. And you can make a very good case that Luke's final words, into your hands I commit my spirit, that those fit perfectly well with Luke's agenda. And they have different agendas in the portrayal of Jesus, and both of those sayings fit well with their agenda. And so I think that calls it into question whether we can trust any of those. And my sense is there was nobody there taking notes. I don't think we have any idea what he said.
Scholars try to utilize the Gospel of Mark quite often in attempts to reconstruct the historical Jesus, since it is the first of the Gospels.
Are you saying do they? Yeah, they do. I mean, so this kind of use of Mark goes back to the 19th century. Scholars for a long time before the 19th century were pretty convinced that John was an eyewitness account. And so they tended to trust John more. But in the 19th century, especially, scholars started realizing that the ancient Christian testimony was probably right, that John was the final gospel, and that it's not giving a kind of nuts and bolts, what really happened kind of thing, but it's more of a theological understanding of Jesus. So if you think that John is probably the last and maybe the most theologically powerful and the most interesting in some ways in terms of its understanding of Jesus, that it's not necessarily historically accurate, you're left with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And in the 19th century, scholars then tried to figure out, well, which of those is the earliest? And they knew that somebody was copying somebody else, because they have so many agreements. They're sometimes word for word the same, sentences the same, and you just can't get that unless somebody's copying someone else. And for a variety of reasons, they end up arguing that Mark was the first gospel and that Matthew and Luke had both used Mark. So it made Mark the earliest gospel. So in the second half of the 19th century, scholar after scholar wrote lives of Jesus. They'd write a book, the life of Jesus. And in their books, almost always what they would do is they'd use Mark as their basis. And Mark is the one that we can trust the most. And then they would fill out Mark's narrative with their own speculations based on their understanding of things. And so Mark was always kind of it. I'd say since for the last 70 years or so, almost all scholars agree Mark was the first. Most scholars agree that Mark is probably, by and large, the most reliable, but nobody thinks you can just take Mark's word for it and say, okay, well, that's it. Because Luke and Matthew had their own sources, John had his own sources. They're all based on their sources, and so you can't simply choose your favorite gospel and go verse by verse and say this is what happened. And so that's why scholars use these various criteria that I laid out at the beginning of how you evaluate. You look at all the sayings and all the gospels and evaluate them. But earlier is better, obviously. And so Mark, tends to get more attention than the others in some ways.
And what were the primary reasons for dismissing the Gospel of John as being an eyewitness account?
Well, there are a number of things. Like the other Gospels, John does not claim to be an eyewitness account. It's written in the third person about Jesus. The only place where the author uses the first person pronoun is at the very beginning. He says, that that when the Word of God was made flesh, we beheld His glory. And so some people think, well, he's saying that he actually saw Jesus, which is, obviously a possible way to read it. It's, I'd say, more commonly read as saying, he revealed himself to us. That he's not saying that, I was there. If he was saying that I was there, then he doesn't say it anywhere else. And at the end of the gospel, he says that the disciple whom Jesus loved bore witness to Jesus. And he says, the one who has seen these things has testified, and we know that his testimony is true. Well, there he's differentiating himself from the eyewitness. So the first thing to point out is he doesn't claim to be an eyewitness either, certainly not explicitly, and I don't think implicitly. He doesn't claim to be John, the son of Zebedee, doesn't claim to be anybody like the other Gospels he's writing anonymously. If he was an eyewitness, if he was somebody who had been with Jesus, seen him do what he did, heard him say what he heard, you would almost certainly expect him to use the authority of his presence as to support his claims about Jesus. And he never does. It's always reported in the third person. Moreover, it's usually thought because of its more advanced theological understanding of Jesus, far more developed theologically than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that it probably comes at a period. It's normally dated to the 90s of the Common Era, or even a little bit later, maybe. And if that's the case, then I don't see how it could have been written by somebody who was an eyewitness in the days of Jesus. The guy would have to be in his 90s or almost 100 years old, and that did not happen a lot in the ancient world. So I don't think so. It doesn't claim to be by an eyewitness, and I think it's certainly not.
Mike JJ, thank you for your super chat. Michael E, thank you for your super chat. Without much new data coming in, how does innovation occur in the study of the New Testament? For example, is Christianity is just a Greco-Roman myth, really a novel idea based on new findings?
Oh, yeah. The idea that Romans made this thing up. Yeah, that's a new one. And it has no credit. No, I don't know. I mean, it's the kind of thing you'll find on the internet, and you'll find people writing books, but not scholars. I don't know any scholar takes it that serious. It's so easy to destroy that idea. It is innovation, and it's not based on new findings. It's based on somebody wanting to make some money or to stir things up. So where does innovation come from? There actually are innovative things that happen in New Testament studies, just as there are in the study of all antiquity. Roman antiquity, Greek antiquity, ancient Near Eastern antiquity and stuff. The way the innovation comes are from a couple of sources. One is new manuscripts appear, and so we continue to find new manuscripts, including manuscripts of the New Testament. I mean, every year it seems like some fragment or other of the New Testament shows up, and that helps us know a little bit more about what the original text said. Also, new writings appear. Not that long ago, 16, 17 years ago, I don't remember. Maybe 19 years ago, the Gospel of Judas showed up, a gospel that we knew about, who didn't have it. That didn't help us know more about Jesus per se, but it helped us know a lot about more about early Christianity in ways. And so new discoveries help. The other thing that helps is that as scholarship develops, we just learn more. I mean, it seems crazy that you can learn more, but we are actually learning more things about the ancient world all the time through diligent research. In a lot of it's detailed research that has wider implications. And so, I mean, I'll give you an example from my book, Misquoting Jesus, which is how you introduced this. For almost all of modern scholarship, when scholars were trying to figure out what the words of the New Testament originally were, given the fact that we have so many different manuscripts, we have lots of different manuscripts of the New Testament, and people tended to think that the only thing that mattered was finding the original text of the New Testament, and they consistently maintained, not always, but consistently maintained, that scribes never changed their writings of the New Testament when they were copying them for theological reasons. And now we just know that's completely wrong. And that's just been within the last 40, 50 years. That there were a couple of people who suspected that before, but the full studies of this haven't happened until fairly recently.
And I think what he meant by the question, like, is Christianity just a Greco-Roman myth, is not referring to the idea that the Romans made the whole thing up, but some scholars see Christianity as having parallels with Greco-Roman myth, and some other people reading that literature, like mythicists, will say, "Oh, that's evidence that the whole thing is myth and it was just made up."
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say that such as mythicists. They're the only ones who say that.
Right.
There aren't other people who say that. So, well, yeah, scholars have known, Christian scholars since the 2nd century have known that there are similarities between the stories of Jesus and the Greek and Roman myths. So that's not a new discovery. That's an old discovery. And when you have mythicists, when you do have mythicists coming up with their kind of explanations for who Jesus really is, he's really a sun god that got crucified in the heavens or something. Yeah, they're just making that stuff up. There aren't data behind it. Which ancient sources say that, for example? So you just make it up. It doesn't mean it's wrong because somebody made it. Maybe they have a keen insight, but most of it's like information and data. So, but that would be right. That's not based on new data. That's just old data that people have interpreted in different ways.
And what about the Q source? Did the Q source that Matthew and Luke used undergo any revisions prior to them utilizing it? And basically, and my next part of the question is, does the contents of Q largely portray what Jesus actually said, or is even that highly questionable?
Okay, so these are really complicated questions. And we could do an entire show on this. My friend Mark Goodacre has written books on this. So his books are meant to show that Q never existed. And so he has stirred up that pot because since the 19th century, it's been pretty much the consensus among scholars that there was a Q. And Mark Goodacre, following his teacher, who was following his teacher, Michael Goulder was Mark Goodacre's teacher, and he thought there was no Q, and he didn't think there was a Q because of his teacher Farrer, and the Farrer hypothesis says there's no Q. So let me explain. I think probably most of your listeners know what we're talking about, but just in case, I said earlier that Matthew and Luke both copied Mark and got a lot of their stories from Mark. There are also a number of sayings in Matthew and Luke that they have that Mark doesn't have. So they didn't get it from Mark because he doesn't have them, but they're sometimes word for word the same. So there's copying going on again. And the question is, did Matthew copy Luke? Did Luke copy Matthew? Or did they both copy some source we don't have anymore? There are very good reasons for thinking that Luke did not copy Matthew and that Matthew did not copy Luke. Mark Goodacre's solution to this, the Farrer hypothesis, is that actually Matthew copied Mark and that Luke copied both Matthew and Mark. That's why you get the similarities between the three. But most scholars continue to think that that doesn't work, and that what happened is Matthew and Luke copied Mark, and they had access to some other source that contained mainly Jesus' sayings. They both had access to the source. Possibly it wasn't word for word the same in the different copies they had, wherever they were, whenever they were living, but they had the same source. And scholars have called that source Q. It's called Q because the German word for this source, it's the sayings source. The sayings source, the word for source is Quelle in German, which is Quelle. And so it's the sayings Quelle. And so they just call it Q, short for Quelle. All right. So so if that existed, I'm going to assume it did exist because I think it did exist. I think that's the best explanation. So if it did exist, two questions. One is, did it go through revisions? And secondly, does it accurately report what Jesus said? So with respect to revisions, this is the claim of a number of people. I think the claim is not nearly as vibrant now as it was 20 or 30 years ago. But 20 or 30 years ago, there was a big push to argue that Q actually went through various revisions and that you can isolate the various levels of revision in Q. This is a very tricky business because we don't have Q. It's hard enough to show that a source you do have went through revisions and which parts went to which revisions. This is trying to do it with a source we don't even have. And many people think that is just too speculative. You just can't do it as much as you'd like to. And it is worth noting that the people who really liked this hypothesis tended to be people who had a particular view of Jesus. So just to kind of get in the weeds just for a second, scholars since the beginning of the 20th century have largely argued, it's not everybody's view, but the majority view has been that Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher who said that the world was going to come to a crashing end soon, that God was going to wipe out everything opposed to him, and he's going to reward his followers and destroy his enemies. And that was going to happen soon. So this is an apocalyptic view that Jesus is predicting the imminent end of the world. In the 70s and 80s, 1970s and 80s, and into the 90s, there were a number of scholars who didn't like that view of Jesus for one reason or another. And they argued that Jesus was not predicting an apocalyptic end that was soon to come. One of the problems they had with claiming Jesus did not claim that, one of the problems is that our two earliest sources, Mark and Q, consistently do show Jesus saying that. So what do you do with that? Well, what they did with Q is they argued that Q actually went through numerous revisions. The first edition of Q, the one closest to Jesus, the first edition did not have apocalyptic materials in it. It was only at a later stage that apocalyptic materials got added to it. Therefore, our earliest source does not have Jesus as an apocalypticist. Okay, so it fit their agenda very well. But other scholars looked at it and said, actually, it's kind of hard to come up with multiple layers. And so they had Q1, Q2, and Q3. And so by the time you get to Q3, you have an apocalyptic Jesus, but that's later. So I don't think today most people are doing that. So at least that's my impression. So if there was a Q, and I think there probably was, all we know is that it was probably a document, must have been written, had to be in Greek, that Matthew and Luke had access to, that mainly had sayings of Jesus. Is it necessarily accurate? Your second question. Does it represent what Jesus really said? Subject the sayings of Q to the same criteria that we do to other bits of the gospel. Sayings, what Jesus says in this verse that's found in Q, does it coincide with what he says in other places, in other sources? Can you fit it into the first century? Is this something that a Christian follower would have desperately wanted to put on his lips or not? So those are the criteria. A number of things probably are authentic, and a number of them are probably not authentic. And you have to go one by one.
How early do the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament date to?
So it's usually thought still today that our very earliest manuscript is one that's called P52. The oldest manuscripts we have are written on papyrus. Later manuscripts are written on parchment, vellum, animal skins. The earliest are written on papyrus, which is a reed that could be manufactured into a writing material. It's kind of like paper, but it's made out of this reed, papyrus. The earliest manuscripts, the first hundreds of years, are written on papyrus, and those manuscripts are known as P something or other. P52 is a papyrus manuscript. That's why it's P. It's 52 because it was the 52nd papyrus manuscript that was known and cataloged. And so that's just the reason for P52. It's the size of a credit card. It's just a little piece of a manuscript. The rest of the manuscript's been destroyed by whatever reason. And we have this little fragment, and it contains verses from John chapter 18 and 19, the trial of Jesus before Pilate, written on the front and the back. And scholars have traditionally dated this manuscript to the first half of the 2nd century. We can't put a precise date on it. It's dated on the basis of a handwriting analysis. So we know how different Greek scribes copied their manuscripts at different time periods. There's some debate about it. Some scholars now think it actually should be later than that. But sometime in the first half of the 2nd century, that's our earliest scrap. Our earliest kind of like a fuller piece of something, where you get multiple pages of something, is around the year 200. We have copies of the Gospels, for example, that are, they're not the whole Gospel of Mark or Luke, or they're sizable chunks of, some virtually complete pages and other things missing. That's around 200. We don't have a complete manuscript of the entire New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, like the whole thing. We don't have of any of those we don't have a complete of any of those books until the second half of the 4th century. Around 370, 375 is when we get some of the fullest ones. And after that, you start getting the complete copies. So we do have some very early copies. If the Gospel of John was written around 95, say, and this thing was written, say, 125 or 140 or something, then it'd be 40, whatever that is, 30, 40 years later, we have a copy of, just not much of a copy, but at least we have evidence of it that early.
JM, thank you for your super chat. Michael E, thank you for your super chat. Did the Johannine community exist? Love your podcast, Dr. Ehrman.
Thanks. Yeah. So as you know, I've got a podcast called Misquoting Jesus, and and Michael apparently listened to the episode where I interviewed my colleague Hugo Mendez, who is writing a book trying to argue there was no Johannine community in the sense scholars have argued since the 1970s. I hope he's wrong, because I've always taught it, but he's got some pretty convincing arguments. I don't know. So I don't know if it exists or not. For those of you who don't know what this is, the Johannine community refers to the idea that behind the writings attributed to John, the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and possibly the book of Revelation of John, but certainly the epistles and the Gospel all emanate out of the same Christian community that was a kind of tightly knit community that had its own perspectives on things that were different from the perspectives you get in, say, the communities of Paul or Matthew's community or Luke's community. It was its own community, and the similarities among these various writings can be attributed to the fact, taken as a fact, that they were written by authors with similar theological views in the same socio-historical context, the same community. Hugo Mendez, this has been an orthodoxy among critical scholars since the writings of J. Lewis Martin, his very important book, History and Theology in the Fourth Gospel, and Raymond Brown, his book, The Community of the Beloved Disciple. These are two really influential books, and they very interesting book, very, very, very good books. But Hugo's trying to argue that, in fact, it's not true. And that you can't line this up with a community. So his book is going to be revolutionary within our field. I'm holding on to the idea of Johannine community for now. And I think it's especially a useful way of understanding what's behind the Gospel of John. I'm not as bothered about 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Hugo's spending most of his time right now in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. But I think that behind the Gospel of John, there is a distinct community, and that this author's views have been formed within the context of the life of that community, and it's shaped how he understands who Jesus is. I think it's still a very helpful way to understand the Gospel of John. But, as with all things, I think, scholarship advances, and, I'm a dinosaur as it is, but I don't want to be an extinct dinosaur. So I accept things that are new that come along. So if somebody convinces me, that I'll be convinced. I don't have a stake in any of this stuff personally. So I don't have a stake in it. So I just, I'm happy to go with what. But it takes something to convince me. Is the thing. It takes good evidence to convince me.
You say that basically all we can do is, for example, reconstruct Galatians as best we can, and the earliest manuscript of that text dates to around 200 CE, and we do not possess the original text of Galatians. That being an example of us not having any of the original texts of the various books in the New Testament. So in light of that, how do scholars go about reconstructing these texts from the various manuscripts, and how confident can one be that these texts at least largely resemble the originals?
So this is what my original scholarship was. I did my PhD dissertation dealing with this kind of question. I did a master's thesis dealing with this kind of question. I spent the first 20 years of my life, my scholarly life, dealing with this question. And so this is a question that would take a long time to answer. So what I can say is that, I think I know just about all the experts on this stuff in the world for the last 40 years or something. And I don't think anybody who's an expert who actually knows what this is about has serious doubts about basically having the basic right idea. When you read Galatians, you basically are getting probably mostly what Paul wrote. It's possible that's not. It's possible that's not. And you can't know. This is the thing. People get upset with me because I say, well, we basically know, but you can't know. And they say, well, you just said you can basically know. Yeah, okay. So fundamentalists are really interested in knowing exactly which word was written in each place. You've got to know exactly what's going on. You cannot know that. You probably have a pretty good idea. With something like the letter to the Galatians, let me explain the complications here, because it's really, in fact, when I explain the complications, half of your people listening is going to say, yeah, actually, we can't know. But experts do think you can basically know. But here's the complication. Paul dictated the letter to the Galatians. And it's not just one community. Galatians is an entire region throughout what is now, if you think about Turkey and you go to the center, you go north to south, kind of north to south in the center, that was the region of Galatia, and there were numerous churches there. Paul's writing this letter to these numerous churches. And so that's interesting. Does it mean that he wrote one letter and each church copied it for the next church? Or does it mean that he wrote one letter and different scribes, while he was dictating it, wrote down the letter that he dictated? Did he write multiple copies? Did he make multiple copies? He didn't do it himself, because at the end of his letter, he says, see with what large letters I'm writing you, at the very end of Galatians, which is almost always taken to mean that some scribes written out what he dictated, and at the end he added his little postscript so they would realize it's really from him. Okay, so he dictates this thing, and we don't know how many he dictated, just one or many. So when he dictates, what if the scribe who's taking down the dictation writes a word wrong? He hears one word and it's a different word, or somebody in the room coughs, or the scribe's attention strays for a second. What was that? Oh, okay. So what if he changes it? What's the original text? Is it what Paul said, or is it what the scribe wrote? Well, we have no access to what he said. But what if the scribe wrote something wrong? Is the wrong thing the original text? And suppose there are 10 copies of it that Paul sent out. Well, if he sent out 10 copies, what if those 10 copies were slightly different from each other in places? Which one's the original text? And then it gets copied, and the copies get copied, and all 10 of them get copied and copied and copied. And we don't have any copies for 140 years when we get a copy. Well, which one is it the copy of the 10? And what happened was you had these 10, 9 of them got burned in fires, one of them survived, but it got copied by some other scribe who changed a few things. Then the original got lost. Then all the other copies came from the copy that the scribe changed, so that our surviving copies all go from the changed copy, not from the original copy. See what I'm saying? And so like, so that shows the difficulty, and that's why fundamentalists just are, they really cannot claim that we know what these words were. We don't know. But if you're just thinking kind of about kind of practical probabilities, when somebody copies a letter of Paul, they, as a rule, are not trying to write their own letter. They're copying somebody else's letter. If they want to make their letter, they just write a letter. And so it is possible that scribes radically changed the letter to the Galatians. But if they did, among none of our hundreds of copies of it do we have any evidence of it. And so what we do have are lots of little changes and sometimes big changes. I mean, not huge changes, not like we have entire paragraphs missing or in different manuscripts, but there are changes in Galatians and in all the books of the New Testament. There are places where we can't agree what the author originally said in all of these books. And so, probably, I think we pretty much know what Paul wrote, but we don't have the kind of certitude that conservative evangelicals want.
Does the book of Acts and Paul's letters contradict one another in any significant ways?
I think the answer is absolutely yes, they do. It's so the book of Acts is about the spread of Christianity after Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension. The book of Acts is a historical narrative that covers 30 years from the time of Jesus' ascension, from the time of his resurrection, to the time when Paul has been arrested and is a prisoner in Rome, preaching the gospel in Rome. It's about how the apostles, especially Peter and John early on, spread the gospel, and then how Paul spread the gospel in the second 2/3 of the book, and about his missionary journeys and so forth. Now, it's a historical narrative, and so one can ask, is the history that it narrates correct? Did it really happen the way Acts says? Most of the things that Acts talks about, we don't have any supporting evidence for one way or the other. What happened on the day of Pentecost, 50 days after Jesus' death? Well, Acts has a story in chapter 2, and we don't have any other records from anybody of any kind to evaluate it. And so you evaluate those on other grounds. When it comes to Paul's missionary work, though, there are a number of things that Acts talks about that Paul also talks about in his letters. And so you can compare what Acts says with what Paul says about the same event. And just about every time you do that, Acts tends to get kind of the broad thing right, and it tends to get the details wrong, and sometimes in really significant ways. I'll give you one example. Paul starts out as a persecutor. Paul says that, Acts says that. Paul converted to believe in Jesus on the basis of some kind of vision he had. Acts says that, Paul says that. Okay, so the broad thing is right. Paul, after his conversion, is in Damascus. Paul says that, Acts says that. Okay, great. Paul, in telling that part of the story, tells the Galatians, this is Galatians chapters 1 and 2, he says, when I converted, I went to Arabia, and then I went back to Damascus. I was there for 3 years, and I did not consult with the apostles who were before me. And he swears to God that he's telling the truth. I did not see. After 3 years, I went to Jerusalem and I saw Cephas and also James. That was it. So 3 years later. So he's trying to show, look, I did not get my message from the others. I got my message directly from Christ. I didn't even go to Jerusalem for 3 years. And then I only saw Cephas and a little bit of James. That's it. So that's his point. In the book of Acts, Paul gets converted. He's in Damascus. As soon as he leaves Damascus, he goes straight to Jerusalem. It's the first thing he does. And he consults with the apostles. Acts is trying to show that Paul and the other apostles were on the same page. they agreed on everything in the book of Acts. It's just one happy family among those apostles, Paul and the others. In Galatians, it's not that way at all. Paul does not consult with the apostles. He has his own gospel. If they disagree with him, they're wrong, and he has to actually go there to convince them that he's right. And so it's a very, very different portrayal, but it's down in the details, because you can just look at the general picture. Persecutor, vision, Damascus, ends up seeing the apostles. It's all the same, right? Well, no, it's not. It's very different.
Greg Hilton, thank you for your super chat. Was a verse in the LXX revised from past to future tense, so it appeared to foretell Christ?
Yeah, well, thanks, Greg. It's a good question. The one passage that maybe the one you're thinking of, that a lot of people have talked about, is the passage in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. Where I don't know if this is the one, but it may be. This is where Isaiah is quoted in the Gospel of Matthew. In Matthew's birth narrative, Matthew quotes this passage, Isaiah 7:14, to show why Jesus was born of a virgin. And Matthew quotes the verse as saying, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us." So a virgin will conceive and will have a son, and then you call him Emmanuel. When you actually look at the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah 7:14, it's worded very differently. For one thing, it doesn't use the word virgin for this woman. It doesn't use the Hebrew word virgin, Bethulah. It uses the Hebrew word for young woman. A young woman. And that word alma, young woman, it could mean a young woman who's a virgin. It could mean a young woman who's not a virgin. It has nothing to do with her virginity. She's a young woman. So a young woman has conceived, and she will bear a son, and you'll call his name Emmanuel, etc. So it's that she's already pregnant, and she's going to give birth to a boy, not a girl. She's going to give birth to a boy. Okay, so the question is, did the Septuagint revise from past to future? The reason that's kind of a complicated question is because Greek does have past tenses and future tense and future tenses. Hebrew, technically speaking, does not have a past tense and a future tense. Hebrew doesn't work like the languages most of us are familiar with, where you get past and future tenses. It's a Semitic language. It's not Indo-European. In this Semitic language, they have what's called a perfect tense and an imperfect tense. And that does not translate immediately into past and future. A perfect tense refers to an event that has been completed, and an imperfect tense refers to something that has not been completed. And you think, well, that's past and future, right? No, not necessarily. You can talk about something happened in the past, and when you're talking about it, you use the imperfect because in your story, it hasn't been completed yet. And so imperfect just means the action hasn't been completed. The verse in Isaiah 7:14 uses a perfect tense for this woman having conceived. It means she's conceived and it's over and done with. She has conceived. The Septuagint, when Matthew quotes it as a future tense, will conceive. He's basing his translation, not on his rendering, not on the Hebrew, but on the Greek Septuagint. And so if the Septuagint had kept it in the past tense, Matthew would not have been able to use it probably to refer to the virgin birth.
Kevin, non-traductive, thank you for your super chat. Do you think that Jesus might have actually said Papias' 100 sextillion grape story? Jesus must have said many things that weren't written down.
Yeah, so I guess in this case it was written down because we have it in Papias. But it's a very good point. Why don't you get later? You can get later gospels of things that are not written down in the other gospels. Scholars have a term for this. Actually, those are called the agrapha. Agrapha is spelled Agrapha, grapha, like in graphite, the thing in your pencil, the thing you write with. And agrapha is something not written. And of course, all of these agrapha are written someplace because otherwise we wouldn't have access to them. So the question is this agraphon singular? Is this agraphon in Papias possibly historical? And it's certainly possibly historical. Yes, it's possibly historical. I have scholar friends who think that why not? Jesus tends to think it's going to be pretty glorious in the future kingdom of God, and so why not? My sense is that Papias would have no way of knowing if Jesus really said it. He said that he learned this from people who knew the disciples of John, the disciple of Jesus. But the other stories that he tells are also problematic. He doesn't seem to have a clear line to authentic sayings of Jesus or authentic events in the life of Jesus. As one example, he tells the story of the death of Judas. But in this case, he doesn't hang himself, as in Matthew, and he doesn't fall head first and splatter all over the ground, as in Acts. In this case, God punishes him for betraying Jesus, and he swells up. He's so enormous that he can't walk down a street. His head won't fit between the buildings of the street. And it goes on to describe how horrible his genitals are. And when he needs to urinate, worms and pus come out. It's really graphic. And eventually he kind of blows up. I mean, I don't know. So it's just, okay, it's possible that that's what really happened. It's possible, but it doesn't seem likely. And I put the same about the Jesus thing where he says that, every vine will have 1,000 branches. Every branch will have 10,000 branches. Every will have 10,000 boughs, and every bough will have 10,000 sticks. Every stick will have 10,000 grapes. Every 10,000 clusters. Every cluster will have 10,000 grapes. Every grape will yield 10,000, vats of wine or whatever. It's I don't know. It doesn't seem consistent with the kinds of sayings that you get of Jesus in the New Testament, where you might have 30 and 60, 100-fold yield of wheat, but you don't have, 100 sextillion. So I'm not sure it's really consistent with Jesus' teachings otherwise.
How different are the various manuscripts of the New Testament text?
This is not something that can be quantified in the way that you can say, well, they're 76% different. You can compare two manuscripts to each other and see how different they are, but it's very hard to know how to count. This is actually related to what I did for my PhD dissertation. It's trying to calculate the resemblances among manuscripts, and it's a very, very tricky business. How do I put it? There are hundreds of thousands of differences among our manuscripts. And even conservative textual critics today, some evangelical textual critics, think that there are something like 500,000 differences among our manuscripts. Everyone agrees the vast majority of those are completely insignificant. They don't matter for anything. Most of them, the vast majority of them, you cannot replicate in an English translation. So they're different in the Greek. You can't even show the difference in the English. And so they don't matter. Some of them matter a lot. How many matter a lot? I don't know, hundreds, but not 500,000. Some manuscripts are quite different, but they're still recognizably the same. Any manuscript you have of Galatians is basically the same. There will be differences that interpreters take very, very seriously because the differences can matter a lot. Sometimes these differences affect the entire meaning of a passage. Some of them affect the entire meaning of a book. You can easily illustrate this with the Gospel of Luke, for example, which is I did a podcast on the scribal changes of Luke for my Misquoting Jesus podcast, where I showed that they just take a handful of these things and just completely changes what Luke's trying to say. So they're small, even if they're small changes, they can matter a lot. A really good book on this that I like, that I had nothing to do with, is David Parker's book, The Living Text of the Gospels, where he shows how different gospel manuscripts can be. And I think it's a really interesting book. He asked me to read it before he published it. He wanted me to give him some feedback on it. So I read it, and he had this chart where he had these 3 columns of the story. And I read it, and when I read through, I was just reading these columns, and I thought, why is he presenting a Matthew, Mark, and Luke thing? Why is he presenting the story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Because they were so different. And I thought, that's weird. You had sentences thrown in and sentences taken out. I was like, wow, why is he doing that in the book about the manuscript? Then I realized, wait a second, these are not 3 different gospels telling the same story. This is the same gospel in 3 different manuscripts. Whoa, that's a nice illustration. So, but I don't have a percentage available. Some of them are different, but the differences tend to be small. But sometimes they're big, but the small ones even can make a big difference.
The Muslim apologist, thank you for your super chat. Would the Gospel of Thomas be closest to what scholars refer to as the Q source?
Good question. And it depends what one means by closest. So there are, in the Gospel of Thomas, which was discovered in 1945, there are 114 sayings of Jesus. And there's no narratives. There's no action. Jesus, there's no crucifixion, there's no resurrection, but there's no healings, there's no interaction, there's no stories. Just saying, Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said. And so that would be the closest thing we have to Thomas in terms of its form and structure. If Q, that'd be the closest thing to Q. If people are right, that Q is basically a list of Jesus' sayings, then Thomas would be one of the closest things we have to, at least early on, one of the closest things we have to it. It'd be a sayings source like Q. And a number of the sayings in Q are found in slightly different forms in the Gospel of Thomas. So there's also overlap. But it's not close in the sense that if you read Thomas, you're reading something like Q. It's a very different document, and it has a lot of things in Thomas. There are a lot of things in Thomas that you would never ever have found in Q. About half of these sayings strike modern readers who are familiar with the Gospels. About half of Thomas's sayings strike modern readers as very odd because they're not like the Gospels. And these odd sayings, it just shows these things are not like the stuff you would have found in Q.
How do scholars distinguish from an accidental change in the text when they were copying it by hand in these different manuscripts from a deliberate change in these manuscripts?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, you've got a scribe copying a manuscript, and so he's got a manuscript and he's copying it, and he words the verse differently. He words the sentence differently from what's in his copy. And is it that he just messed up, or did he want to change it and change it intentionally? Almost everybody's convinced that both things did happen. When you have something like the story of the woman taken in adultery, which was added to the Gospel of John by scribes, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't by a slip of the pen. It's not like misspelling a word because you're not paying attention. Somebody added an entire story. Okay, so that's probably intentional. It is sometimes it's pretty obvious that there are accidents. Most of the vast majority of the changes must be purely accidental. People misspell a word. They'll leave out a word. They'll add a word. They'll repeat the word twice. They'll leave out a sentence. They'll leave out a line because this line ends with some words, and the next line ends with the same words. And when the scribe copies those words, he's copied them from the first line, but then he thinks he copied them from the second line, so he goes to the third line. He's left out a line. So it's just an accident. And a lot of the accidents don't make any sense. So it's pretty clear it's an accident. But there are places where it's clearly intentional, and there are a lot of places where we just can't tell. You have to kind of make an argument because sometimes I'll give you an example of this. This would be an example that maybe a lot of people will not know. In Romans chapter 5, verse 1, Paul is explaining, now that he's laid out his idea about how people are made right with God, how they are justified with God. He says in Romans, right after he's done that, he says in chapter 5, verse 1, now that we have been justified, we have peace with God. Okay, But some manuscripts say, now that we have been justified, let us have peace with God. In other words, we need to go out and find it. And it's a difference of one letter. It's a difference between an omicron and an omega, the O letter, a long O or a short O. And if somebody's dictating this letter, the long O and the short O sound exactly the same. So did a scribe change it because he just misheard it? Or did a scribe change it because he thought the theology was wrong? Like if it said, let us have peace with God, someone's saying, yeah, no, it can't be let us have. It must be we do have. Of course we do if we're justified. Or, and so they changed it. So there's no way to know what was going on in the scribe's head in some cases. In other cases, it's pretty clear.
Warren Maroney, thank you for your super chat. If we don't have the original source autographs for at least the ones tested to be like Q, L, M, etc., how can we really know what Jesus said?
Well, as I was saying, I don't think we can really know if what we mean is, can we know for certain? And it's even more complicated than that because Q, M, and L, and Mark, etc., were written in Greek. And Jesus was speaking in Aramaic. So even if you know what the Greek version of his saying is, you don't know how it corresponds necessarily to the Aramaic. Not only that, but the sayings have been in circulation before anybody wrote them down. Even if you had Q, L, and M, even if you had the originals, they were getting these sayings from stories that had been circulating for decades before they wrote them down. So how just having Q wouldn't tell you if Jesus really said it. It just means you've got this Greek copy of things that somebody thought he said. And so, so it's problematic because of the oral tradition that went on for years and then decades before anybody wrote them down. It's complicated by the fact that it's gone from Aramaic into Greek, but then it's complicated by the fact that we don't have the originals of any of these sources. And so scribes change those and say, oh my God. So it gets really complicated, but at every level, what you do is you establish probabilities. It's a very exacting business, and it's really hard. And you've got to know the ancient languages, and you got to go one verse, virtually one word at a time, and spend years doing it. It's not the kind of thing you just got to do it. And so, but the people who spend years doing it try to establish levels of probability. Look, this looks like it probably is what Matthew wrote, and it's just like what you find in Luke. So it probably did come from Q, and this probably is what Q wrote. Okay, if that's what Q wrote, what was the Aramaic behind it? And if it's the Aramaic behind it, is it something that Jesus originally said or not? That's the kind of sequence you have to go through. And each step is very difficult.
What were often the theological motivations for some of these deliberate textual changes?
In the generation before me, in the I guess it come out in the late 1960s. I can't remember right now. When Eldon Epp wrote a book called "The Theological Tendencies of Codex Bezae in Codex Cantabrigiensis." There's a title for you. Eldon was a great textual scholar. He was sort of a generation before me, and he argued that there's a particular manuscript of the Book of Acts that Codex D, that actually the author, the scribe of the Codex, implemented his anti-Jewish sentiments into his account. He changed them more anti-Jewish. That got me thinking when I was doing my work, and elder predecessors, but not many who thought that. So in my first really major book was called The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. And it was written and it got published, I think, in 1993, maybe. And what I did is every manuscript difference that I could find in the entire New Testament, verse by verse, to examine whether it looked like the changes could have been made because of Christological issues, because of controversies over who Christ was. Was he fully human but not divine? Was he fully divine but not human? Was he what, this, that, and the other thing? And I categorized every one that I could find, and that's what my book is, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, which argued that there are dozens and dozens of important, some of them really important, changes of the text that appear to have been made intentionally, that change the meaning because of Christological controversies. That's the main theological controversies that we know about. But other people could do other kinds of books. I had a PhD student, for example, write a book many years later. Wayne Canaday published a book that tried to show that Christians trying to defend the Christian faith against pagan attacks changed their manuscripts in places to make the Bible, the New Testament, more suitable for use against opponents, pagan opponents. And he tried to show that. And Kim Haynes-Eitzen and others have written to try and show how views of women have changed in manuscripts and so on. So there are some, but the one particular theological one that we know about are the Christological controversies. And I don't know if that's the majority of the changes, but they're the ones I know. I think they probably are.
John D., thank you for your super chat. Do you think that there's anything to Richard Miller's idea that the early Christians didn't hang their hat on the Gospels being literally historically true?
I don't think so. But you can't know for sure. And the reason you can't know for sure is because we don't have any readers' reports. When you're a sophomore in high school, you got to do a reader's report. Report what's in this book. We don't have any of those. What we have fairly soon, at least in the 2nd century, are Christian authors talking about the Gospels and quoting the Gospels. And in every case, they appear to think that they were literally true. They never take them as pure metaphor or as non-historical. They might think that they have metaphorical significance or theological significance, but it's never at the expense of them being literally right. The early readers appear to have all taken them as literally true. I think many people today are inclined to think, oh, they couldn't have. Really? Come on. But, in the 21st century America, many of us might look at stories in the Gospels and think, there's no way a sane human being can believe that. But, the reality is that over, probably around 2 billion sane people do believe it still. And there's no reason to think they didn't in the ancient world. I don't know of any credible reason to think that they were not taken literally. And in the earliest references to them, they are taken literally. So I think they were taken literally.
What do you make of Irenaeus suggesting that the Gospel of Mark portrays a separated Jesus from the Christ, similar to that of the Gnostics who embrace a separationist theology?
I don't think Irenaeus takes that view. I think he argues against it. So I'd have to see what passages you're referring to. Irenaeus, he does refer to Gnostic groups that appear to think that when Jesus was baptized, as he is in the Gospel of Mark, and the Spirit of God came upon him, that was when the eon from the pleroma entered into Christ. So in Gnostic think, okay, I guess I need to back up for a second. So I need to explain a separationist Christology and how this relates to Gnosticism. Sorry, but Gnostics are people who were Christian Gnostics were groups of Christians who believed that it wasn't the death and resurrection of Jesus that brought salvation. It was the secret knowledge that he brought, knowledge about who human beings really were. The humans actually, within us, we have a soul that came from a higher realm. And if you know yourself, you know who you really are, then you're given the knowledge necessary to return to this higher realm at death. And some Gnostics argued that Jesus himself did not belong to this realm, which means that he couldn't have been born here. He wasn't a physical creature the way we are. He's not from here. He came for a while, the divine Christ from above, from the area, the divine realm that they call the pleroma, the fullness. Christ came down and came into the body of the man Jesus. So that Jesus was just a rest of us, but he was human like the rest of us. But the Christ came into Jesus at his baptism, which is why he could begin preaching such amazing teachings and why he could do such amazing miracles is because a divine being was within him. So that happens at the baptism, and then when Jesus is crucified, the divine element leaves Jesus to go back to the pleroma. So it's just between his baptism and his crucifixion that Jesus has the Christ being within him. So that's a separationist Christology, because you have the man Jesus who is a separate being from the divine Christ, and they're temporarily united. And so Gnostics argued that, and Irenaeus talks about that view, and he makes fun of it. and he gives some very interesting information that we wouldn't have otherwise. We don't know if it's completely reliable, but he says that, for example, there's a Gnostic group that points out that when the dove comes upon Jesus at his baptism, the Gospel of Mark says that the dove, the Spirit of God, comes into Jesus, eis auton in the Greek. He comes into him. It can mean upon him, but more normally be into him. And these Gnostics point out that the Greek word for dove, peristeron, if you add up the letters, like the first letter, the pi is worth a certain amount, the iota is worth a certain amount, they use their alphabet. Letters of the alphabet are also their numbers, okay? So every word has letters that each have a number. You can add up the numbers. If you add up the word for dove, the Greek word for dove, it adds up to 801. That is the same number if you add up alpha and omega. Christ is the alpha and the omega. The alpha and the omega come into Jesus when he is baptized. See, that's how they interpret this text. So Irenaeus makes fun of that. So I don't know, and maybe Jacob, you've got some passages in mind, but I don't know that Irenaeus accepts the separationist Christology. He holds to an incarnational view.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to say that it was Irenaeus' view, but it comes from it comes from page 174 in your misquoting Jesus.
Yeah.
When you
Okay. Yeah. He definitely talks about the view, and he says that there's some of the church fathers indicate that.
Correction, I meant page 172.
Okay, but he talked about these Gnostics, and he argues against it. But I point that out in my book. I actually deal with it at greater length in my book, Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, because I try to show how scribes sometimes change their texts in order to preclude that kind of argument from Mark.
Warren Maroney, thank you for your super chat. Did the earliest Christians have the highest Christology as we do today, especially in light of adaptionism, subordinatism, development?
Yeah. So when scholars talk about Christology, they sometimes talk in terms of a high Christology and a low Christology. And what they mean by that is that if Jesus is both human and divine, human means he's kind of down here on earth with the rest of us, and divine means he's up there in heaven with God. And how does it work exactly? Is he more human or more divine, or is he like 50% of each, or is he 100% of each, or what is it? A low Christology says that Jesus is principally human, and maybe he becomes a divine being, but it starts out that so that's a low Christology, because he's not inherently God. He doesn't start out as God. He's a human that God chooses. A high Christology says that Christ is principally God, and a really high Christology, it may be held by a lot of people today. It was declared a heresy in early Christianity. The highest Christology is that Jesus is not human at all. He's not at all from down here, and that he's God. And even on earth, he's God. He's not human. He only seems to be human. That was a view that scholars have called Docetism, and it's a view that was condemned early in the 2nd century by Orthodox church fathers who said, look, if Jesus isn't really human, he couldn't die for sins. If he didn't have human blood, he couldn't shed his blood. If he didn't shed his blood, you're not saved. And so they didn't like that idea. Did the earliest Christians have a very high Christology? My view is that they did not, but they did think that Jesus was divine. By Christian in this context, I'm referring to people who believe that Jesus is the way of salvation. I think that belief starts after Jesus' death. I think it starts as soon as some of his followers think that he got raised from the dead. I think this was some of his disciples who some of them said they had seen him alive. And if he's alive, he's not here, obviously, look around. So where is he? They thought that he had been taken from the realm of the dead and taken up to heaven to live with God, and that he's going to come back. So in ancient thinking, Greek, Roman, Jewish, anyone who's taken up to the divine realm is made immortal. And immortal in ancient Greek thinking, ancient thinking generally, meant godlike, being a god. I think the earliest followers of Jesus thought that Jesus was made into a divine being at his resurrection. Some later came to think, oh, it happened at his baptism, so his whole ministry was divine. And then later they said, oh, actually, he got born of a virgin, so he's divine his entire life. Later they said, actually, he existed before he was born. And the Christology got higher and higher. It didn't get higher and higher at the same time in every place. People, different places, different times had different Christologies, just as they are today. But I think the earliest Christology was adoptionist, where Jesus is adopted to be the Son of God at his resurrection. Eventually, Jesus has thought himself to be inherently God, but for a long time, most Christians thought that meant that he was subordinate to God the Father, that he's not equal with God. How can you be equal with God? God's almighty. Somebody else can't be almighty. If you've got two almighties, neither one of them is almighty. And so he's got to be subordinate. So the Son of God is not as great as the Father. And so they were subordinate. But then when you get into the 4th century, starting with the Council of Nicaea, especially, they started saying, no, he's equal with God. He's actually equal with God, the same substance with the Father. And so at that point, that's a pretty high Christology. And they didn't have that early on, I think.
Gettysburg Demoniac, thank you for your super chat. If we found an early copy of Mark, do you think Jesus would be convicted for something about blasphemy?
I don't think he is convicted of blasphemy in Mark. He is convicted in the sense that the high priest says he's guilty of committing blasphemy, but he's not condemned to death for it. The legal conviction is over his claim that he called himself the King of the Jews in Mark and in all the other Gospels. But I think the question is, do I think, at the trial in Mark's Gospel, the high priest is trying to find some way to bring a charge against Jesus. And he asks him, are you the Messiah? Throughout Mark's Gospel up to this point, Jesus has never openly said he's the Messiah. But when the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, the Son of God, Jesus said, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven in glory of the Father, or whatever. And so he says that, and the high priest screams out blasphemy. He tears his robe and says he's worthy of death, and everybody, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, agrees, and they hand him over to Pilate, but not on charges of blasphemy. So it's very interesting. One reason it's really interesting that many people haven't noticed is that Jesus never commits a blasphemy. Now, people try to construe this passage in Mark 14 so that Jesus commits a blasphemy, but he does not. When the high priest says, are you the Messiah, the Son of God? He's asking him, are you the future king of Israel? Jesus says, I am. That's not a blasphemy. Some people say, well, the fact that he said, I am, is the blasphemy because he's claiming the name of God. No, I don't think he is. If somebody asks you something, are you this? In Greek, you often just reply, I am. Are you the guy who threw the trash on my lawn? Yeah, I am. It doesn't. So, and it's not that everywhere in the New Testament where the phrase ego eimi, I am, means I am God. Even in the Gospel of John, the Gospel of John is the only place where I am refers to God, Gospel of John. But even in the Gospel of John, in John chapter 9, the man born blind is healed by Jesus. The Pharisees don't believe Jesus could have done it. They ask the guy, are you the guy who's born blind? And he replies, ego eimi, I am. They don't take him out to stone him to death. He's just answering their question. So when it comes as an answer to a question, it's not claiming to be. So Jesus he's not blaspheming and claiming he's the Messiah. He's just saying he's the future king. There's no blasphemy there. He's not saying I am, is just answering the question. And he's not blaspheming by saying the high priest is going to see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. That's what Daniel says. All he's saying is that Daniel's prophecy is going to be fulfilled in your day. That's not a blasphemy. So the problem is, I think this is maybe what our Gettysburg demoniac legion here is referring to, is that there's no blasphemy there. Maybe he's not referring to that. But the question is, would he have been convicted by something else if we got the original mark? No, I don't think so. I think what we've got is probably what happens in the original mark. I can't prove it. And, I'm not going to wouldn't stake my house on it, but I think there's no reason not to think so. Every copy of Mark has that ending, has that passage like that. So I don't have any reason to suspect it's not original to Mark.
Some apologists, thank you for your super chat. Do you think that there is a distinct theological shift from John 3:1-15 to John 3:16-21? Is the latter part of the original text?
Okay, it's a good question. It's a little bit complicated. I'm not going to get into all of it. I will say, for those who don't know, that John 3 is where Jesus has a conversation with Nicodemus, where Nicodemus comes up to him and says, "We know you're a great teacher, sent from God." And Jesus tells him, "You must be born from above, or you can't see the kingdom of heaven." Sometimes often translated, "You must be born again." But it's a word that probably means you must have a heavenly birth if you're going to see the kingdom of heaven. And then Jesus launches into this discussion with Nicodemus, where Jesus goes into a monologue for a while. In verse 16, we get the famous verse that used to be behind the home plate every year during the World Series. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that anyone who believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." And it goes from there in John. So is there a break between what Jesus is saying in 15 and what happens then with 16 and following? The chapter goes all the way to verse 31, and I think most people think that 16 through 31 is a kind of unit. I don't know any textual scholar or any scholar who thinks that the end of the chapter was not original. It is almost certainly original to John. It uses Johannine vocabulary. It's in Johannine writing style. It is theologically right up the line of what John has to say elsewhere. So I think the end of John 3 does go back to John. The big question, as it turns out, is one that would not occur to most people. It has to do, Jesus stopped talking in this chapter, and when does the narrator start? So the problem, and it's precisely at the break that this person is identified between verses 15 and 16. The original manuscript and none of our Greek manuscripts has punctuation, and so we don't have quotation marks. So we don't know where Jesus is being quoted. Is it from chapter 3, verses 1-15, or is it all the way to the end of verse 31? A lot of scholars think that it ends with verse 15. The Jesus quotation ends with 15, and the narrator is the one that starts in with verse 16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son." And that the rest of it is not quoting Jesus. But in a number of translations, the quotation marks come at the end of verse 31, showing that's the entire thing that Jesus said. And so there's a dispute, and there's no way to resolve it satisfactorily to everybody. My view is that probably Jesus stops talking in verse 15. But I don't think that makes 16 and following a later edition. I think it was original.
Gettysburg demoniac, thank you for your super chat. Does Mark 12:35-37 suppose that Jesus knew he wasn't from Davidic descent?
Our Gettysburg demoniac is reading the text very carefully here. Okay, this is this controversy where the Sadducees, Jesus has come to Jerusalem the last week of his life, and the Sadducees are trying to trip him up. They're trying to get him to say something that'll get him in trouble. And so he turns the tables on them. And he asks them, how can the Messiah be the son of David? Because David calls his son the Lord. In the Psalm, what is it? Psalm 110 says, the Lord God said to my Lord David, "You are my son today." No, I'm sorry. It's not "you are my son." My Lord says to my Lord, And then, he does quote the thing about I'll make your enemies footstool under your feet. So God is calling him Lord. So, but it's in David's psalm. That's what it is. David allegedly wrote this psalm. And so he calls the son of David, it's written by David, the son of David. It's written by David. And he calls the future Messiah Lord. How can he call him Lord if he's his son? That's the question. So Jesus asked this question to the Sadducees. They have no idea. I don't know how that works. And so Jesus, well, I won't answer your question either. That kind of thing. So doesn't that presuppose that Jesus knew that he was not of Davidic descent? Because how can the Messiah be the son of David? Can't be the son of David if he's the Lord of David. There are a number of ways to interpret this passage. One thing to say is we don't know if Jesus ever said it. So the question really is whether Mark thought that Jesus wasn't of Davidic descent. Mark, though, does have Jesus called Son of David in this gospel. And so he does think that Jesus is the son of David, apparently. So how do you understand this text? One way to understand it, this is my favorite way of understanding, is that Mark is pulling a kind of trick that you find in other controversies in ancient Greek writings. You find it a lot in the writings of Plato. When Socrates is having a discussion with somebody about what something means or what something's all about, Socrates almost never comes up with the answer. What he does is he confuses the people he's talking to make them realize they don't know the answer. This is part of Socrates' strategy to show that he's smarter than anyone else because he knows that he doesn't know, and he proves to these other people they don't know. So it's not meant to have an answer. It's meant to confuse the opponent. And I think that's what's going on with Jesus and the Sadducees here. He comes up with a conundrum that they can't answer. And so since they can't answer his conundrum, he's not going to answer what they want to know.
Iceberg Demoniac, thank you for your super chat. On what grounds were the titles of authorship assigned to each of the Gospels? Tradition, eyewitness, location of community?
We don't know for certain. The first time that they are called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is in the writings of Irenaeus, whom we talked about earlier. We have some pretty good speculation that has a pretty wide agreement among scholars, I think. So two of the Gospels, Matthew and John, are attributed to disciples of Jesus, followers of Jesus. Mark and Luke are attributed to companions of Peter and Paul. And so you get two disciples and the accounts, connect with Peter and Paul, the two most important apostles. And so that's good. But why for each of these? In some cases, it's more obvious than in others. In the case of the gospel, it's not obvious in any case. I'll go backwards. Gospel of John. John has a figure called the beloved disciple, the disciple that Jesus loved. And he seems to be an eyewitness to what happened in Jesus' life. And people came to think that John, that the disciple Jesus loved, is the one who wrote the gospel, actually wrote the gospel. Well, who would be the disciple that Jesus loved who could write the gospel? Somebody who was with Jesus in his ministry. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the three closest disciples are Peter, James, and John. It must be one of them, but it can't be Peter because Peter shows up alongside the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John, so he can't be the beloved disciple. It can't be James because James was known to have been martyred in the early days of the church. Very early on, he was martyred by King Herod. That leaves John. So John is the beloved disciple who wrote the Gospel of John. That's the logic there. Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke is written by the same person who wrote the book of Acts. The book of Acts, in 4 passages, the author, talking about Paul's missionary journeys, shifts from talking about what Paul and his followers did to what we did, what happened to us. That makes it look like he was a companion of Paul. Acts is largely about how Paul's missionary work converted Gentiles. Both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts are concerned about the conversion of Gentiles. That appears to mean that it's a Gentile author. Who is a Gentile companion of Paul? Well, we know from the Pauline letters that Paul had a Gentile companion named Luke, who was a doctor. And so they said, okay, that's who wrote Luke and Acts. The Gospel of Mark is a shorter version, and it is not attributed to one of the disciples, but it is thought to have apostolic authority. Peter is a prominent figure in the Gospel of Mark, as in the others, but in Mark he stands out, and so it's thought, well, this is somebody who's giving Peter's account, but Peter doesn't claim to have written it. And so it's known that Peter had a companion in early Christianity named John Mark. And so they said John Mark was the companion to Peter. He wrote this gospel. Matthew was thought to be written by one of the disciples, but which one? Some people noted that the call of Matthew in Matthew chapter 9, when Matthew's called to be a disciple, the author of Matthew has changed the name of Levi. This account's in the Gospel of Mark, but there's the call of Levi. Matthew changes it to Matthew, and some people said, well, this must be somebody closely connected with this. And maybe he has two names, and so it must be Matthew. Matthew and Levi are the same person. So Matthew, who else would be concerned about Matthew? This must be Matthew's version. And so they came up with Matthew. So anyway, so those are, they came up with reasons. The real reasons, I think, are probably hard to know historically. Hard to know why those four. That's the logic people started using once they started using logic.
Teresa Werby, thank you for your super chat. Why wouldn't early writings have been started to be compiled in Israel within the first few years after Jesus' life, rather than only oral tradition?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There seem to be a couple of reasons for it. The earliest followers of Jesus, of course, were his disciples and those that they knew. In Israel at the time, literacy was extremely low. The fullest study of this phenomenon by a woman named Catherine Hetzer, called Literacy in Roman Palestine, argues that only 3% of the population could write. To be able to write a book required years and years and years of education. Today, that's common. Most people go through high school. A lot of people go through college. But most college kids could not write a book like the Gospel of Mark. They just couldn't write it that way. It takes years and years of practice. Jesus' followers were lower class, illiterate peasants from Galilee who spoke Aramaic. These Gospels, our Gospels are written in Greek. Could there have been earlier Aramaic Gospels? There could have been, but we don't have any trace of them. And there's nothing to suggest that the apostles could write. Why didn't somebody start writing one 10 years later? I don't know. Maybe they did. Luke claims that many people preceded him in writing Gospels, but he's writing 50 years after Jesus' death. One reason people have speculated that Christians were not interested in writing Gospels is because they all were convinced that Jesus was returning soon and that it was going to happen soon in their own day. So who are you going to write a Gospel for? You're not going to write it for posterity. There's not going to be any posterity. And so it may be that with the passing of time, they just trusted that, people are telling these stories. The apostles started the stories. These are stories from the apostles. That's fine. They trusted oral tradition then. They shouldn't have, but they did. They trusted oral tradition. And they probably thought it was good enough. But as soon as the apostles start dying off, and maybe even after they're all dead, people say, look, somebody needs to write this down. And by that time, you have educated people who can do it, and people who think, okay, Jesus isn't coming back next week, so I'm going to do it.
Greg Helton, thank you for your super chat. Bart, what is the likelihood that the story of Judas's betrayal is fiction, and have you written about this question?
Yes, I have written about it. I mentioned earlier the Gospel of Judas that was discovered not long ago. In the early 2000s, it reappeared, and I was asked by National Geographic to look into this gospel with a team of others. And so we had access to it before it was public. And so I got really interested in this Gospel of Judas, and I got really interested in Judas. And we had to sign non-disclosure agreements, so we couldn't talk about it publicly. But I got them to agree to let me write a book about it that could be released 6 months after the public announcement of it. And so I wrote a book called The Lost Gospel of Judas Iscariot. And I decided to make the book not just about this gospel, which is a Gnostic gospel that is not historically reliable, but is very interesting. I also have, though, historical interest in Judas himself. And so a large chunk of my book is about the historical Judas. And one of the things I consider is whether the betrayal is fiction. I think that it's not fiction. I think that there really was a Judas who was identified as somebody named Judas Iscariot, and that he really did betray Jesus. My reasoning for that takes about a chapter to explain, so I'm not going to be able to get into it. The argument that's floated around more and more these days is that Judas was made up as a kind of anti-Jewish slander. The name Judas sounds like Jew, and comes from Judah, the land of the Jews. And so is it just an accident that the Judean, the Jew, is the one who betrays Jesus? And people thought, that's a little bit too uncomfortable to be, to be false. And probably it's made up. And so it's a good argument, but I don't think it's right. I'm not opposed to it. I don't think it has the balance of probability on its side. I'll just say a couple things very quickly. One is he's consistently identified as Iscariot. We have no idea what the word Iscariot means. And we have ideas. There are lots of ideas. There are like 27 ideas what Iscariot means, but it's not obvious, and it's not the kind of name you would expect somebody to give to this person because we don't know what it means. And so you'd expect him to. And so that's one thing. More important thing is the betrayal, of course, is attested widely in independent sources with various stories about it. That helps confirm it probably goes way back. Third thing is it doesn't seem to be the kind of story that Christians would have invented. It doesn't seem to have been the kind of story that Christians would have invented. And so the reason is because this is one of Jesus' insiders. Jesus is supposed to be this authoritative son of God when people, his followers are just absorbed with his authority. And here this guy just goes against one of his followers. You could see like one of the members of the Sanhedrin maybe, or a Sadducee or a Pharisee, coming up with the goods, but not one of his own followers. That just, he has no more authority than that. And so there are reasons for thinking that there was this Judas Iscariot, and I go into greater depth in my book. But my short answer is no. I don't think it's made up. I think it really happened in some way. I don't know exactly how it happened, but I think it did happen.
Gettysburg Demoniac, thank you for your super chat. What heretical sect of Christianity has the best foundation for their doctrine in the text of the New Testament?
I don't know whether they mean modern sect or ancient sect. Do you have an idea, Jacob?
I don't know. He's not specifying.
Okay. So my view is that virtually every sect of Christianity has a very good foundation for their doctrine in the text of the New Testament. The reason is that the text of the New Testament is not self-interpreting, meaning that anytime you have words on a page, they don't mean something until you provide them with a meaning. You can't ask a word what it means. I mean, just now, I just read this thing, what heretical sect, and I didn't know whether it meant ancient or modern, and I can't ask the text the question and get an answer. I have to interpret it. And there's no way not. It's true of every sentence you've ever read. You have to interpret it, and different interpreters will interpret different sentences differently. The New Testament is made up of sentences, and every sentence could be interpreted in a different way. So you could interpret the New Testament text to say that Jesus is fully human, but he's not really God. You could interpret to say that Jesus is really God, but he's not really human. You could interpret to say that Jesus Christ is two beings, one divine and one human. You could interpret to say that Jesus' death and his resurrection brought about salvation. You can read it to say Jesus actually never really died. It's a different way of reading it. The question is, what are the more probable interpretations? But for sects, sects just go with their interpretation. So for that reason, they all have a good foundation in the New Testament.
How does Luke portray an imperpetual Jesus?
Say that again?
How does Luke's gospel portray an imperpetual Jesus?
I don't know what imperpetual means. Does that mean that he's not always lived, maybe? That Jesus has not always been existent?
Yeah, I think that's... I remember you mentioning something like that in the book. I don't remember the exact page. I don't have it in front of me.
Well, I talk about Luke portraying Jesus as somebody who comes into existence with a virgin birth. Okay. And I also talk about Luke portraying Jesus as somebody who doesn't have a passion, that he doesn't suffer. It sounds like they're asking about whether Jesus came into existence at some point, according to Luke. So I'll answer that question. It's a very interesting question. Christians traditionally, since the 2nd century, have thought that Jesus, he existed from before his birth. He pre-existed. And since the 4th century, at least, the majority of Christians have thought that Jesus always existed. There's never a time that he did not exist. That's been the traditional view of Christianity. And so what I have, this isn't my art. I didn't come up with this. So you just read the text. A lot of people have noticed this. When you read the Gospel of Luke, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus comes into existence when he is conceived by Mary through the Holy Spirit. The evidence of this is in the announcement, the Annunciation, when the angel Gabriel comes to Mary. So she's a young woman, not married. She's betrothed to Joseph. They've never had sex. And the angel Gabriel says, "You're going to conceive a son." And Mary says, "Whoa, what? I've never known a man," meaning in the biblical sense, I've never had sex with a man. And the angel then replies that he says, "The Holy Spirit shall come upon you. The power of the Most High shall overshadow you. So the one born from you shall be called Holy, the Son of God." The reason Jesus is the Son of God is because God gets Mary pregnant. He comes into existence at the point of the conception. And so Luke has a virgin birth, but it does not have a pre-existence of Jesus. And that contrasts with Paul, who has a pre-existence of Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. So he goes all the way back in eternity. And then he becomes a human being, and he became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. So in John, the pre-existent divine Word of God, who is God, becomes a human. But there's no word of a virgin birth. So Luke has a virgin birth, but no pre-existence. John has a pre-existence, but no virgin birth. And what traditional Christian theology does then is it smashes the two together, so that you end up with Jesus, who became incarnate through the Virgin Mary. Incarnate comes from John, Virgin Mary comes from Luke, and they're actually incommensurate, but we put them together to make them gel.
What are the 4 textual variants of the final chapters of Luke? What's going on there?
The 4? Well, there are dozens, actually. So let me look up Luke to see what the 4 are that this person probably has in mind. That he says the 4 textual?
Well, I remember I bookmarked it. I had to find it, but somewhere in here you mentioned something about 4 specific.
Yeah, I probably mentioned 4 specific ones. If you tell me the references, I can tell you what they're all about. I don't think I've got a copy of the book here. Oh, here it is. Okay. Misquoting Jesus, Gospel of Mark. Oh no, where's Mark? Where's the index? Oh no, yeah, here it is. Okay. It's Luke's Gospel. Is that what he said?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I can't find
No,
I
no,
can't
no,
find the page.
yeah, I've got it. I've got an index that'll tell me. So, sorry, let me just see what they are. Okay, Luke, right, got it. Okay. Oh, yeah, these are interesting. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. So there's only of these four. They're not all four are not important, but a couple of them are. So the one that
Okay.
is, you want me to deal with the ones that are?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the first of the four that are, there's one that's kind of interesting. Oh, no, that's not very interesting. Actually, there's only one that really is a kicker. In the last chapter of, the one that's really a kicker that matters for things is Luke chapter 24, verses 51 to 52. And so, I'm sorry. This is taking long. This is the one that's been written about the most, and it has to do with whether Jesus ascends to heaven when he dies. And so what happened after he dies? So in Luke 24, it says, Jesus led them to the disciples. He's raised from the dead now. He led them out as far as Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. While he blessed them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. And they returned to Jerusalem with great joy and were continually in the temple praising God. Okay, so this last bit where he says, while he blessed them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. Those words, and was carried up to heaven, are not found in a key witness of the Gospel in the Gospel of Luke. Some scholars have suspected that, in fact, it is an addition to the text. It's not found in two of our earliest witnesses, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Bezae, the one I was mentioning earlier. It's not found in some Latin witnesses, and it's not found in one of the Syriac manuscripts. And so it's a change that would have been made very early on in the history of Christianity, that he was carried up into heaven. And the reason it matters is because if you read Luke 24, this is happening on the day that Jesus was raised from the dead. If you just start with chapter 24 and you start at the beginning, it's on the day of the resurrection, and everything that happens is dated after that. And then immediately they did in this. And when the sun went down, they went this. And while Jesus was still talking to them, they did this. It's like, what? It's happening on the same day. And then he's taken up to heaven. The reason that's an issue is because he's also taken up to heaven in Acts chapter 1, written by the same guy, written by Luke. And in Acts chapter 1, what happens is Jesus doesn't go up to heaven the day of his resurrection. It's 40 days later. He spends 40 days with the disciples, proving that he's been raised from the dead. And then after 40 days, he gives them his last instructions, and they watch him physically ascend to heaven. And okay, so how's that work? I mean, does it happen the day of his resurrection, or does it happen 40 years later, 40 days later, 40 days later? It depends which of these books you read, and they're both written by the same person, the same author. And so the textual variant in chapter 24, verse 51 is really complicated, because you could argue different things. You could say that Luke originally had this in his Gospels, Luke, that he was taken up to heaven, and he had at the beginning of Acts that he went up 40 days later, and the scribe, realizing the contradiction, took it out of Luke. He omitted it. That omission, the shorter text without that line, is found in most of our manuscripts, including our best manuscripts, our earliest best manuscript. So maybe a scribe took it out. But it's in there in most manuscripts. And so maybe a scribe put it in. That's your choice. A scribe took it out, or a scribe put it in. But why would a scribe put it in? You can see why you take it out, but why did we? And I actually make an argument in my book, Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. I refer to it in my book, Misquoted Jesus. But my argument in the Orthodox Corruption of Scripture is that a scribe put it in. Put it in because it shows that Jesus was physically taken up to heaven. That matters because many we know of Gnostic groups and other groups that were using, we know of people who didn't believe Jesus was fully human, who used the Gospel of Luke. And so scribes throughout the Gospel of Luke were adding things to make it show that Jesus really was a tangible material being, not just a spiritual being. And I argue in my book that that's what happens here, is that the scribe is adding it here. And that Luke's not an idiot who forgets that he's just said that he ascended 40 days earlier. In fact, he didn't say that. It's a scribal addition, is what I argue.
When do you think that addition to the text was made?
Well, it's in as I said, it's in one of our best 4th century manuscripts, Sinaiticus. It's in a 5th century manuscript, Codex D, which is very interesting. It's in both the Syriac and the Latin, in Syriac and Latin manuscripts. Normally, that combination of witnesses, if you've got that particular combination of witnesses of Syriac, Latin, Codex D, and even if you have Sinaiticus, it's usually thought that that's a change that's been made in the 2nd century. So it could have been made early. It could have been made, within 50 years of Luke's gospel.
And then my closing question, is the Gospel of John really independent of the Synoptics? And I know that's a thing that's still being debated, but I also know a lot of scholars still think that John is either largely or totally independent of the Synoptics.
It's a very difficult question. The way I'll get to it is by pointing out what I said earlier, that the reason that we know that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have copying going on is because you have lots of the same stories, often in the same sequence, and almost usually in the same sequence, and often actually word for word the same. That's what you do not get with the Gospel of John in relationship to the Synoptics. If you look at the ministry of Jesus in chapters 1 through 11, John has not entirely different stories, but almost entirely different stories. All of his speeches in John, he gives lengthy speeches. None of them are found in the Synoptics. None of the Synoptic sayings of Jesus are found in John. The activities are largely different. There are some similarity. There's similarities. He heals the sick and he raises the dead. But the stories themselves are almost entirely different, except for a couple of exceptions. He feeds the multitudes with loaves and fishes, and he walks on water. That's similar, but the stories themselves aren't similar at all. Like when you read those stories, there aren't word for word similarities. You start getting more similarities once Jesus goes to Jerusalem during the Passover, for the Passover feast. And so the Passion narrative has more similar stories. You have Jesus going into Jerusalem, and you have him teaching there, and you have him finding opposition there, and you have him being betrayed by Judas. And he has a last meal and betrayed by Judas, and appears before Jewish authorities and goes handed over to Pilate. So the basic storyline is similar in many ways. The details are different up and down the line, very different. So the question is, did John know the Synoptics? When I was in graduate school in the 70s and 80s, there was a consensus that virtually everybody agreed John did not know the Synoptics. That was just the standard line. That has shifted in recent years, as scholarship always shifts on old texts where you don't have a lot more text to talk about. And so you disagree with what people said in the previous generation, so you can publish your book. It's like, they were all wrong. And so now the pendulum's shifting the other way, where a lot of people are saying John did know the Synoptics. That would not mean that John copied the Synoptics, because he didn't. He wouldn't have copied the Synoptics. The argument is that there are sufficient broad similarities And that if you look in some details, there are things that make you think, even though he's not copying it, he seems to have known their stories that make people think John probably did know the Synoptic. So my colleague I mentioned before, Hugo Mendez, thinks this, and he's not alone. This seems to be the way the field is moving. As a dinosaur in the field, I'm not moving with it. I have a higher threshold of proof from a lot of my colleagues who do this kind of thing. I think that if you have two authors who are talking about a similar topic, if they don't have word for word agreements, you don't know that one is used to the other. In the modern day, if somebody if somebody writes a book about the manuscripts of the New Testament and says the kinds of things that I've just said on our interview here, I've said some things about the manuscripts of the New Testament, and they say similar things, there'd be no reason to think this person has heard this interview or has read my books, because the kind of things they're talking about are things we all talk about. We talk about the manuscripts, it's just things we talk about. We've all, and so if though the person starts using language precisely like I use, where I say things like, we don't have the original, we have copies of the copies of the copies of the copies. And that's kind of a thing I say a lot. Where I say things like, there are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. These are things that I say, and I don't normally hear other people. That last line, by the way, that there are more words than copy, there are more copies, there are more differences in our copies than words in the New Testament. That's a line that I got from Bruce Metzger. A lot of people get angry with me for using that line. Metzger used to say it all the time. He was my teacher, and everybody adores him. It's especially the conservative critics who criticize me for saying it, but I got it from Metzger. So that would be an example of something where you could show, well, I got it from someone else because he said it before me, and I say exactly the same thing. And if somebody else says the same things, then they're probably getting it from me, because I don't think Metzger ever wrote it. He may have written it. So I look for verbatim agreements, and you don't get those. The other side, though, that John did know the Synoptics, has a very good argument. The best argument is that this kind of writing, a gospel, that goes at least from the baptism of Jesus to his resurrection, and is designed to tell stories about Jesus, narratives to show that he's the Son of God, sayings to show that he's the Son of God, and that have similar stories about the Passion, and that it would be really hard to imagine that two people independently came up with that idea of writing a book like that. And that's the strongest argument, that John knew the Synoptics, because it's unlikely that he independently would have come up with the same genre. So I get that. It's a strong argument, but it's not strong enough for me. The reason it's not strong enough for me is because people were telling stories about Jesus, the same stories, year after year after year. And the big point was always that he went to Jerusalem, and probably the sequence of things, he had this triumphal entry, and that, and he went to the temple, and he roused the authorities' ire, and that he got turned over to the Sanhedrin by Judas. And, those things would naturally fall into a sequence. And I think they did fall into a sequence, even outside of the Gospels. And so the idea that you would have somebody write down what's happening in the oral tradition all over the place doesn't seem to me to require that John knew the Synoptics. The other thing that's really important to me, sorry, I'm going on about this, but I'll end with this, is I think a lot of my colleagues are too much oriented toward modern views of writing. We are literary people as scholars. We always think in terms of books. And in the ancient world, most people did not think in terms of books. We think so much in terms of books that if we have two books, all we can do is try to imagine who borrowed from whom. Or if we have a story in one thing that sounds vaguely like a story in another, then we say, oh, actually, he got it from Plato. Or if Mark has something that's kind of like Homer, oh, he got it from Homer, or she got it from, like you connect all the dots. But the thing is, we don't have most of the dots. There were hundreds of thousands of people telling stories about Jesus. There were, how many documents were surviving from early Christianity? I don't know. How many gospels were written? Luke said a lot. Maybe John knew one of these other gospels. I don't know what he knew, but he doesn't indicate that he had these as sources, and I don't think he did. I don't think the evidence is good enough. So I think it's independent.
So what exactly is textual criticism?
Right. So it's a term frequently misunderstood by people who are not scholars, because one would think the textual criticism would be the study of text, so literary, trying to understand like what do the texts mean, or what kind of contradictions are in the text, or things like that. And it's not that. Textual criticism is a technical term that refers to not just in New Testament, but in any field, Shakespearean studies, any kind of literary studies, Milton, whatever. Textual criticism is the attempt to use the surviving texts of a document to determine what the author originally wrote and to see how that was changed. And so if somebody is an expert in Shakespeare, for example, there are different forms of the text of Hamlet. There's not like a single manuscript that goes back to Shakespeare. And so they have to compare the various forms available to try to see what Shakespeare originally wrote. And it's the same thing with the New Testament. Textual criticism is trying to establish the text, trying to know what the author said, and then trying to know what how people changed it.
Now, just how many manuscript families of the New Testament are we dealing with here?
Okay, well, so let me just start with the manuscripts. We have over 5,600 manuscripts, which the word manuscript means handwritten copy. And so not ones that have been printed, but ones by, printing press, but handwritten. We have about 5,600 of those. The problem is that there's so many of them that it's very difficult for scholars to examine all of them, because suppose you've got a passage in Matthew, suppose you've got a verse in Matthew, and different manuscripts word this verse differently, and you want to know, well, which wording did the author originally write, and why did somebody change it? And so if you've got hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts just of Matthew, it's not really very useful to be able to have to read through every manuscript at that point. And so what scholars have done for since the 18th century is to try and see if there are groups of manuscripts that cohere with one another, so that manuscripts have basically the same kind of text. And so which manuscripts fall into which group? And you know that by looking at the similarities and differences among the various manuscripts. Scholars who are interested in groups of manuscripts then have names for these groups. And when the people who do this kind of grouping agree that they're the various kinds of groups, there are some basic ones: the Alexandrian text, the Western text, the Byzantine text. These are all designations to refer to groups of manuscripts that basically cohere with one another, so that if you know what the group reading is, you don't have to look at every manuscript in the group.
And which one of those manuscript families is typically preferred in reconstructing the New Testament?
So there have been long debates about it. The scholar, so I need to say up front, because some people might know this, that many scholars today have gotten away from the very idea of trying to group manuscripts. I myself have long been interested in establishing family groups, and it's what I did a lot of my early scholarship on, is trying to figure out manuscript groups. Those who do manuscript groups have tended to prefer what's called the Alexandrian text. It's a group of manuscripts that in some way or another appear to be related to scribal activities in the city of Alexandria, Egypt, in the early centuries of Christianity. The largest group is called the Byzantine text. Sometimes it's called the Syrian text. There are various names for it, but it's the majority of manuscripts that come from the Middle Ages. So that people who tend to be very, very conservative evangelical scholars, fundamentalist scholars, often prefer that Byzantine text. And historically, in no small measure, has been because that's the form of the text that the King James Bible is based on, roughly speaking. And so those who think that the King James is the best translation, or those who are doubtful about scholarship since the 19th century, often prefer the Byzantine text. Most other scholars would prefer what we call the Alexandrian text.
What are the major differences between the Byzantine text and the Alexandrian text type?
So when scholars started classifying these groups, they started realizing that there were some key passages that are supported by one group or another. And there are many passages that are sort of readers' favorites that are absent from some of the oldest and best Alexandrian manuscripts, but are found in virtually all of the Byzantine manuscripts. And so, for example, the woman taken in adultery, where this woman is dragged before Jesus for being caught in the act of adultery, and Jesus writes on the ground and stands up, and they want to know, what does Jesus want to do with her? Does he want to condemn her too? And he says, let the one without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her. They all walk away in shame for their own sins until she's left alone. And Jesus says to her, is there no one here left to condemn you? And she says, no, Lord, no one. And he says, neither do I condemn you, and go and sin no more. Okay, so this is a favorite story. It's in it's in every Jesus movie ever made. And it's found in the Gospel of John, chapter 7 and 8, in the King James Bible, and in most manuscripts from the Byzantine period, but it's not found in the earlier Alexandrian manuscripts. And so it is widely thought then that this was not an original writing of John. It was inserted by a scribe. The Byzantine text tends to be a little bit longer. It tends to be a little bit more full. It tends to be a little more comprehensible. It seems to have fewer kind of problems in ways. And so naturally, some people don't like it, but it appears to be the older form of the text.
How do scholars determine if a text has been edited?
Do you mean edited, or do you mean changed by scribes?
Changed by scribes is really what I meant.
Yeah. So, some people say, look, scribes wouldn't have changed manuscripts. But the reality is, as I said, we've got 5,600 of them, manuscripts, and we can simply compare them to one another. When somebody is starting to be trained in the field of textual criticism, one of the first things they are taught is how to read a handwritten copy, a manuscript. And the writing differed from time to time. The oldest manuscripts are done in what look to us like capital letters. The manuscripts of the Middle Ages look more like what we would think of as cursive writing. But scholars are taught how to read these things. And one of the early tasks that students being trained in this field learn is how to collate a manuscript. Collating a manuscript is when suppose you're comparing two manuscripts with one another to see how they relate to each other. One way to do that is to take each manuscript, instead of comparing each manuscript to each other, what you do is you compare this manuscript to some kind of printed text. You choose which printed text to use, and you find all the places where this manuscript has a difference from the printed text. It might leave out a word someplace. It might add a sentence. It might change the spelling of a word. It might, might change the word order. There are things, lots of things that could be changes. you collate the manuscript by finding every single difference, just every minute letter difference between this manuscript and the standard text you're collating against. Collating is comparing a manuscript to a standard text. Then you do the same thing with the second text. You compare all the places where it has something different from the standard text. When you do that, you've got your list of your differences and you can compare them and you can see how many differences these two have in common and how many are different. So what happens if you take all these manuscripts, 5,600 more or more manuscripts, they're all different from each other. Usually not. It's not like, some of them take out 12 chapters from the Gospel of Mark or something. It's not big stuff like that, but word after word after word might be changed in small ways, almost always in small ways. So we know that scribes are changing the texts, and we can tell that they were. How do we know that they were changing the text? Because we have the manuscripts that they produced, and they differ. They differ. I said we have over 5,600 manuscripts. The difference among these manuscripts are in the hundreds of thousands, the differences. And most of the differences don't matter for much, but they're different. And so somebody's changing something, otherwise they'd all be the same.
So basically, you're saying that the differences are usually small; they're not major. So how does one sort out between the small differences to know which one of them is the better reading?
Well, you do it the same way you do with the major readings. You have a set of criteria that you use to evaluate which is which. The small ones, they really don't matter. So of these hundreds of thousands of differences, probably the majority of them would be spelling differences. And the way you spell the word Beelzebub, whether you call him Beelzebub or Beelzebul or something else, it doesn't affect the meaning at all. And so you still have to decide, though, if you are suppose you're a publisher and you want to publish an edition of the Greek New Testament, which would be in printed form. Well, you have to decide what to print. Do you print Beelzebul? Do you print Beelzebub? And so for both the minor differences and for the really major differences, there are criteria that scholars use in order to decide what probably is the oldest form of the text. I'm happy, if you'd like to hear, I can describe these criteria, but it would take a while.
So are any two of the New Testament manuscripts identical?
Well, no two of the full manuscripts. When I say there are 5,600 plus, I'm including tiny little things so I'm including not just full manuscripts that start with Matthew and end with the Revelation and have every word. I'm also including you'll have a copy of Luke that'll be missing 3 pages, and it'll be just Luke missing 3 pages. Or you'll have 1 page from Paul's letter to the Romans. Sometimes we just have a little scrap. The oldest manuscript we have, it's called P52. So it's P for papyrus. It's written on papyrus, which is the older manuscripts are written on papyrus. And it's the 52nd one that was cataloged by the official cataloging place. So it's called P52. It's the size of a credit card. It's in a kind of a triangular shape, and it's got a few lines from John chapter 18 on the front and a few lines from John chapter 19 on the back. It was the account of Jesus' trial before Pilate. The rest of that page was destroyed, maybe wore out or got thrown out or something. The rest of this Gospel of John, all we have is this one little scrap. So we have things from that to entire manuscripts. There will be places where you'll have a little fragment like that will be just like for those verses in some other manuscript. But you'll never have like a manuscript that has a number of pages that will be exactly like another manuscript that has the same pages. There are always some kinds of small differences and often larger ones.
So, do we know how many interpolations had occurred in the New Testament? Or maybe I should rephrase and say, how many interpolations do we so far know have occurred in the New Testament?
So this is another technical term, interpolation, as it turns out. So interpolation is a kind of textual change where somebody's added something to the text. So like for example, if you've got two texts and a scribe has like omitted a word, maybe but he just like his eye skipped over, he just missed it, didn't write it down. That would not be an interpolation. That would be an omission. And so there are all these but I think you're asking how many textual variants there are, how many differences among the manuscripts. When I was writing my dissertation back in a long time ago, back in the Pleistocene age, sometime in the early 80s, the common sense was there were about 300,000 or maybe even 400,000 differences in our manuscripts. Some of them omissions, some of them additions, changes of word ordering, changes of word, misspellings, everything. 300,000 or 400,000. And the most recent estimates have raised that number to 500,000 or more. We haven't been able to know for sure because we haven't been able to collate all the manuscripts, as odd as that seems. Even with the advances of computer technology, there are manuscripts we haven't fully studied yet. And so, but it's today, I think a common number is 400,000 or more likely 500,000.
Why was Luke 3:22 corrected to parallel Mark 1:11?
Okay, so now we're getting now we're getting into the weeds. Okay, so I luckily brought my Greek New Testament with me, so I can make sure. But this particular verse I'm very familiar with because this is a very important passage because Luke has a very different reading from what you find in Mark. It's a passage that's dealing with Jesus' baptism. In Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel begins with Jesus being baptized. It starts out with John the Baptist. And so in Mark, there's no birth narrative. There's nothing about a virgin birth or Bethlehem or anything like that. It starts with John the Baptist. And John the Baptist is making his proclamation that people need to repent for the forgiveness of their sins. And Jesus, and he's baptizing all these people, and Jesus comes to be baptized by him. And in Mark, Jesus gets baptized, and as he comes up out of the water, the heavens split open, and the Spirit of God descends upon Jesus, and he hears a voice that says, "You are my son. In you are my beloved son. In you I'm well pleased." So that's interesting because the voice in Mark's gospel, and only in Mark's gospel, is speaking directly to Jesus. You are my beloved son. One reason that's interesting is because when you get to Matthew, it's changed to "This is my beloved son." And so the voice changes from Mark to Matthew, which might be significant for interpretation. Luke has a very different thing. In Luke's gospel, Jesus gets baptized. He comes up out of the water. The Spirit comes down. Heavens open up, and he hears the voice. And in this case, there are different manuscripts that read differently about what the voice says. And so in the majority of manuscripts, in manuscripts of the Byzantine type, the voice, in fact, is what the voice is in the Gospel of Mark. You are my beloved son, in you I'm well pleased. Let me make sure I get this correct. Yep. So that is a quotation, by the way, of Psalm chapter 2, verse 7. No, I'm sorry. That is a quotation. Wait, let me get all this straight. That is a quotation of Isaiah chapter 42, verse 1. Isaiah chapter 42, verse 1. Now I'm getting it all mucked up. Textual criticism is very confusing, Jacob. All right, let me do this again. You are my beloved son, in you I'm well pleased. That's Isaiah 42. Some old manuscripts have the voice saying something different. Instead of quoting Isaiah 42, it quotes Psalm 2:7. In those manuscripts, the voice says, you are my son, today I have begotten you, or brought you into being as my son. You are my son, today I begotten you. Psalm chapter 2, Psalm 2:7. And so what scholars have to debate then, which reading did Luke originally write? Which one did he write? Did he write the one that sounds just like Mark? Or did he write the one that sounds different from Mark? It's a big issue, because if the voice at the baptism says, you are my son, today I have begotten you, that would suggest that Jesus became the Son of God at his baptism. Today I have made you my son. Whoa. And so which is it? So scholars have to debate. And in this particular case, what's interesting is that very few manuscripts have the one, today I have begotten you. The vast majority have, you are my beloved son. But there are really good reasons for thinking that originally Luke wrote, you are my son, today I have begotten you. So I have a couple of books that deal with this issue. This podcast, this episode, you're calling The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. And that's the title of the book that I have that discusses this passage and many others at length, trying to show what the original text is and trying to show why it got changed. And in that book, and also in my shorter book, that's Jesus, which is not written for scholars, it's written for a lay audience, but I explain the issue there in the book about this verse. In both books, I explain why it looks pretty clear that originally the voice said, you are my son, today I've begotten you. Even though it's not in very many manuscripts, one of the questions you have to ask yourself if you're a textual critic is, suppose you're a scribe, and suppose you're trying to analyze what scribes would be likely to do to a text that they've changed, okay? You've got a scribe who wrote one of these, you've got a scribe who wrote the other one. Which scribe would have wanted to change the text? Because one of them did change the text. And so would a scribe who said, you're my beloved son, in you I'm well pleased, is there some problem with that a scribe would think, wait a second, that can't be right? And he changes it to, you are my beloved, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Well, when scribes are copying these texts in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, scribes did not think, by that time, Christianity was pretty convinced that Jesus did not become the Son of God at his baptism. But some groups of Christians, heretics, were using verses like this to say, this is when Jesus became the Son of God. He wasn't really born of a virgin. He really didn't pre-exist. He did not become incarnate. He was a man who became God's son at the baptism. There were Gnostic groups, for example, that argued that. Okay, so you're a scribe and you've come across this verse, you are my son, today I've begotten you. Would you be likely to want to change the text? Well, yes, because Mark's version is innocuous. And so you change it to Mark's version. And then you don't have a problem with theology anymore because God doesn't say this is the day. And so since the text that would cause scribes the most problems is one text, and the other wouldn't cause them any problems, it's the other text. The text that is going to cause problems is more likely to be what the author wrote. Now, I just want to say, in concluding this little bit here, that this is not some kind of crazy criterion dreamt up by liberal scholars. This criterion is one that goes back to the 18th century to a scholar named Johannes Bengel, who was a very, very pious Lutheran theologian who developed this criterion. And the way he put it in Latin, but basically the English translation of what he said was, the more difficult reading is to be preferred. That means if everything else is equal and you've got these two verses and one would really cause difficulties for a scribe and one wouldn't cause really much of any difficulty, it's more likely a scribe's going to change the difficult one to make it non-problematic than he would to take a non-problematic verse and change it into something difficult. And so this passage appears to have been changed by scribes who were offended at the idea that Christ became the Son of God at the baptism.
So would you say that that is similar to, because you mentioned that is similar to what Gnostic groups think, and like maybe individuals like Corinthus and also the Gospel of the Ebionites, which talks about that the Christ did some sort of angelic possession of Jesus, and he became Jesus Christ, and therefore Jesus became the Son of God at the baptism.
Yeah, so we know about these Gnostic groups going back into the 2nd century who thought precisely this. From the beginning of Christianity, there was always this question about how Jesus can be both divine and human. How can he be both at once? And I think many people today have a kind of a simple answer to that. And, many listeners have an idea about it. But the idea is that developed over time, and there were lots of options in early Christianity. There were some people who said that Jesus was completely God and who wasn't human at all. And there were other people who said that Jesus was completely human and wasn't God at all. And there are other people who said that Jesus Christ is two things. You got the man, Jesus, and the divine Christ. So something like that was put forward by Gnostic Christians who believed that there was a man, Jesus. He was born of the sexual union of Joseph and Mary. He's a human being, but he was very righteous. And there's a entire divine realm up above us. It's not just one God. There's like a kind of an original God, but there are lots of divine beings that are in this divine realm. And to provide salvation, one of them came down to earth in order to communicate the truths necessary for people to escape this material world to join the spirits up in heaven. In this system, this being, sometimes you could call him the Christ, comes down and enters into the man Jesus when he's baptized. And that's why Jesus starts teaching his fantastic teachings at that point and not before. That's why he can do miracles at that point and not before, because at this point, the divine element has come into Jesus at his baptism. You're my son, today I have begotten you. And in some circles, some of these Gnostic circles, the divine Christ then left Jesus when he was crucified. And that's why on the cross in Mark's gospel, for them, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you left me behind? Why have you forsaken me? It's sometimes translated, but it's the word for being left behind. In other words, the divine element has left the man Jesus, and he's wondering, why have you left me now when he's dying? So the spirit comes, the divine figure comes into Jesus at his baptism and takes him out of the world at his crucifixion. And this verse might have been useful for people who had views like that.
So that modification in Luke 3:22, do we know when that happened?
It is usually thought that almost all of the surviving variant readings that we have were made sometime after the books were written up until over the next 200 years or so. So it's usually thought that around the year 300, you're not getting too many major changes in the text. You get some, but not too many major ones. This particular change from "You are my son, today I've begotten you" to "You are my beloved son, in whom I'm well pleased" is found in some of our earliest. That change is found in some of our earliest manuscripts, and so it is. It looks like it must have been changed sometime in the 3rd century at least. So maybe the 2nd or the 3rd century. We don't have manuscripts that would be earlier than that. The passage that says, "Today I have begotten you," is found in just a couple of manuscripts, but it's also quoted that way in church fathers going back to Justin, who was living in the year 150.
So I'm going to take this super chat question from Terry Traster. Thank you for your super chat. You say Jesus was crucified and his followers believe they saw him later. You say you don't have a problem with the resurrection being of a spirit and mass hallucination explaining sightings, correct?
Kind of, but not quite. I don't think there. I'm not a Christian. I don't think there was a resurrection at all. In the way to kind of try and contextualize this question a little bit is that the Jesus himself, of course, was Jewish. His followers were Jewish. They were all Jewish. The people who declared that he was raised from the dead were Jewish. And in Jewish circles, there was not this conception that we know of in Israel at the time, or of what later came to be the Christian idea that the spirit and the body were separable, so that the body could die, but the spirit could live on. The idea of resurrection is a decidedly Jewish idea. You don't get ideas of resurrection, for example, in Greek thinking or Roman thinking. In Greek and Roman thinking, if there's an afterlife, if somebody dies and then they continue existing, it'll be because their bodies died, but their spirit lives on. In a situation like that, you could have a spirit resurrection. You die, your spirit lives on and kind of appears like a ghost or something to people. But that's not the case with the early followers of Jesus because they were Jewish. In Jewish thinking, there's not a separation of the body and the soul where the soul or the spirit can live on when the body dies. In Jewish thinking, the body and the soul are integrated. The human being is an integrated being of body and soul, or body and spirit, so that the human doesn't exist anymore once the body dies, because when the body dies, the spirit dies as well. The ancient thinking in Judaism was that the spirit within you is more like your breath. When God created Adam, he made a lump of clay and a humanoid shape, and it was just a lump of clay on the ground. But then he breathed into it, and the breath is what made it a living being, made it a human being. Well, okay, so the spirit is your breath. That's what makes you alive. Today, when somebody dies and they stop breathing, you don't ask, where'd the breath go? Where's the breath now? It doesn't, no, we know it doesn't exist. Well, that's what Jews in the days of Jesus thought about death. When you're not breathing, when your spirit's not in you, the spirit doesn't exist somewhere. The person's dead now. And the only way the person can come back to life is if the breath is put back into him, if the spirit will re-enter the body. So the disciples, when they believed that Jesus was raised from the dead, as good Jewish believers who this was the only view they knew, if they thought he came back from the dead, necessarily that meant that the breath went back into the body. So the spirit was reunited with the body, and Jesus became a living being again. So they did not believe in the resurrection of a spirit. There's not a spirit resurrection for these people. It's a resurrection by definition is bodily. So I think the disciples some of them believed in a bodily resurrection, and we do have records of multiple people seeing Jesus, including groups of people. Historically, I don't know whether groups of people claim to see Jesus. I personally, I'm not a Christian. I don't think anybody saw Jesus. I don't think he reappeared in any form. But those who saw him early on, Peter and Paul, etc., thought they were seeing a body. If he did, if later you have groups like the 12 disciples, suppose they all said, we saw him. If they say that, then, I think that would have been a group hallucination. And if you say, well, you can't have group hallucinations, then I say, well, yes, you can, because they happen all the time. I often will have Protestant evangelical apologists tell me, look, you can't have a group hallucination. And then I'll say, well, do you think Mary showed up to 1,000 people at this particular point? And I name its time and place. And they'll say, well, no, of course not. So, well, They all said she did. So either she did or as a group hallucination. So you pick. Since they're Protestants, they don't believe Mary is showing up to people, and so they have to agree. Yeah, okay. Well, they thought they saw something they didn't really see. Well, okay. If you say that about this group, you can say about this other group. And so I don't think that group hallucinations are out of the question. I think that there might have been groups who thought they saw Jesus.
I feel like my next question is the perfect follow-up to that super chat. When was Mark 16:9-20 added to the Gospel of Mark?
Okay, so these are usually known as the last 12 verses of Mark, about which there's been controversy, although I'd say today there's far less controversy about these verses than there are about the passage about the baptism. There still are scholars who will say the passage of the baptism, that it got changed the other way, the opposite way from what I'm saying. But in this case, scholars are really pretty unified, except for fundamentalist scholars. I don't know of any scholars, apart from Christian fundamentalists, who think that the last 12 verses of Mark were original. So to set the stage for what I want to say about it, I need to say something about what's going on in these verses. So at the end of Mark's gospel, Jesus has been crucified. He's been buried by Joseph of Arimathea on a Friday afternoon. On a Sunday morning, women come to the tomb to provide a more proper burial. On the Friday afternoon, Joseph was rushed because the sun was going down. The body had to be put in the tomb before sunset, according to Jewish law. And so he hurriedly buried the body, rolled a stone in front of it. So the women are going to the tomb in the next chapter, and they're wondering, how are we going to get the stone away from the door of the tomb? And when they show up, though, the stone's already been rolled away. And there's a young man there who says, you're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He's not here. He's been raised from the dead. Go tell Peter and the disciples that he will meet them in Galilee. So the angel, or the man, he's called a man, a young man, tells the women to inform the disciples so they can meet Jesus in Galilee. And then the next verse says, this is Mark chapter 16, verse 8. The next verse says, the women, though, fled from the tomb and didn't say anything to anyone, for they were afraid. Period. End of gospel. Man, it is a great ending, because the women don't tell. And it's not like they told them the next day or something. They never told anybody. They didn't tell anything to anyone, for they were afraid. And so the gospel ends without the disciples learning that Jesus has been raised from the dead, which is altogether appropriate, because throughout this entire gospels, the disciples never could figure out who Jesus is. And at the end, they still don't figure out who he is. Throughout this gospel, Jesus will heal somebody and say, don't tell anyone, and to go out and tell everybody. Here, the women are told to tell, and they don't tell anyone. So it's just reversed. Don't tell, they do tell. Do tell, they don't tell. And so it's this brilliant ending. But you get to that ending, and it says they didn't say anything to anyone, for they were afraid. And you think, whoa, wait a second. What do you mean? Jesus didn't appear to the disciples? How can that possibly be? And so scribes had exactly the same reaction. They came to the end and they said, whoa, wait a second. What? How could that be? And so they knew that the other gospels talk about Jesus appearing to people, appearing to the disciples, and convincing them he's raised from the dead. And so Mark didn't end that way, but the scribes added an ending, and those are the last 12 verses. Verses 9 and following, the last 12 verses, are the verses that have what happened. These next verses that were added by scribes is that the women go and tell the disciples that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and the disciples go to Galilee and they meet with Jesus, and Jesus has a final talk with them where he tells them to go make disciples and go spread the word throughout the world, and anyone who believes in him will be able to speak in foreign tongues, they'll be able to handle snakes, they'll be able to drink poison, and it won't hurt them. And then he departs from them. Okay, these verses, by the way, are verses that are used by the Appalachian snake handlers to justify their practices of handling snakes in services, because Jesus says you'll be able to. I've always thought that somebody in the ambulance on the way to the hospital taking one of these guys in for treatment should tell them, actually those verses were not originally in Mark. They're not in the Bible originally. But yeah, so anyway, Jacob, your question is, when were these verses first added to the text? And so we have manuscripts that have this verse starting around the year 400. And so they're in several of the key passages, and it may be that they are cited somewhat before that in a couple of church fathers, although it's not quite clear if they're citing precisely these verses in this place. So the answer, sometime in the late 3rd or early 4th century, is probably when this text was added.
I'd like to shift to Matthew real quick, because we've been talking about Mark, Luke, and a little bit about John, but let's take a look at some corruption going on in Matthew. You talk about Matthew 24:36 in comparison to Mark 13:32, I think, in page 107. You talk about how that was problematic for Christians.
Right. So, okay. So you're referring to in my book, Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. Right. So 24:36. So that's yeah. So that's the business of the hold on a sec. 24:36. I thought you were talking about the spear in the side. You're not talking about that one? About the soldier putting the spear in the side?
No, I'm talking about Matthew 24:36. Concerning that day and hour, no one knows, never the angels of heaven.
No. Yeah, no, that I'm sorry, you got it's not. I thought you said, oh God, no, I'm in the wrong chapter. I thought you said, for some reason, I thought you were talking 27 something. Okay.
No, it's page 107. 107.
Well, yeah, I don't have that in front of me, but I should have memorized my pages, but I didn't. So, okay, all right, yeah, okay. So this is the passage of Jesus is talking to the disciples about the end of the age. This is in Jesus' apocalyptic discourse. Mark has Jesus in chapter 13 of Mark has Jesus describing when what's going to happen at the end of time. With the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and then all sorts of cosmic signs, and then the coming of the Son of Man. You have a similar thing in Matthew, but Matthew has a longer speech of Jesus. And in Matthew's version, you have this line where Jesus says that the Son of Man is going to be coming, and so forth and so on. But he says no one knows the day or the hour when the Son of Man will come, no one knows the day or the hour when the Son will come, not the angels, nor even the Son, but God alone. And that phrase, not even the Son, is problematic. And you can see why scribes would find it problematic, because it suggests that the Son of God is not all-knowing. He's not. But if he's not all-knowing, how is he God? I mean, God has to be all-knowing. And surely Jesus knows when the end's going to come. he's the one coming. So surely he knows when. So that was a view that scribes had. They thought, well, it seems that doesn't seem right. And so they took out the line, not even the Son. So in the change form of the text, then it's no one knows the day of the hour, not the angels in heaven, but only the Father. And so it does not any longer say not even the Son. And that way they got rid of the problem.
So now I want to take another super chat. Julia, thank you for your super chat. No question there. Hard work. Thank you for your super chat. Would Bart mind explaining his favorite addition, favorite feature addition coming to NA29 that he's excited about?
I would talk about it if I had any idea what's going to be in Nestle Aland 29. And so the NA, for those who don't know, that refers to the Nestle Aland edition of the Greek New Testament. The this was it's the standard form of the Greek New Testament that scholars use. This is an older version of it here. This is the this one has English on one side and Greek on the other. The Greek side's the one that matters for us, and it has the text with a list of the textual changes found in some of our major manuscripts. This is called the apparatus. The apparatus is that is where they provide in condensed form a description of a number of the changes, nowhere near all of the changes, and nowhere near in all the manuscripts. This edition was first put out by a man named Nestle, and then later it was edited by a man named Aland, and so now it's called the Nestle Aland. It's currently in the 28th edition. It's going to now come into the 29th edition. From what I have gathered from the scholarship that is being done on this, most of the scholarship is being done in Münster, Germany. The kinds of changes that I've heard about them making in the 29th edition are not hugely significant in terms of like big things. I don't know of any big things. It's more like changing a word here and there. They may change some of the important passages, but I don't know that they are. And so when they talk about when the group in Münster talks about how they're changing the text, they'll sometimes give a list. Like in the Book of Acts, these will be the change. These are the changes we're going with, and very rarely do they have any effect on the meaning of the text. So I'm not expecting anything big. I think it'll be really important for scholars because it will have additional evidence for the various different readings, and it will change the text in some places, but I don't think any place significantly.
Can you tell us about any other major interpolations that occurred in the Gospel of Matthew?
Well, there are lots of changes that were made in Matthew. One of my favorite ones comes early on in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew. So to set the stage, in Matthew gives a genealogy of Jesus that traces his family, his parental line, all the way back to Abraham, the father of the Jews. And so it's the very beginning of the gospel. It's not that long of a genealogy. It only takes about 15 or 16 verses. But so Matthew begins by saying the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And so Abraham's the father of the Jews, and the genealogy starts with Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and it goes on like that. And it goes all the way down to Joseph. Jacob was the father of, do it this way. Mathan was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Joseph. And then you have a comment about Jesus. So Joseph, so this is the one married to Mary, or betrothed to Mary. Joseph was the father of Mary, from whom was born Jesus, who is called the Christ. When it says from whom, in Greek, the whom is feminine. And so it's saying that Jesus was born from Mary. it's a very interesting genealogy for lots of reasons. One reason is because Luke also has a genealogy of Jesus that goes down to Joseph. That is a different genealogy. Joseph has a different father, different grandfather, different great-grandfather, all the way back to King David in Luke's genealogy. But another interesting thing is that just within Matthew, this is a genealogy of Jesus that gives a genealogical tree that Jesus does not belong to. This is a patrilinear descent. In other words, from father to son, Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to Joseph, etc., going down to Judah, going down all the way to Joseph. But then Jesus is not related to Joseph because in Matthew, Jesus' mother is a virgin. Joseph has not gotten her pregnant. And so the genealogical line goes to Joseph, but it's broken at that point because Jesus doesn't belong to it because he's not Joseph's son. And so why do you have a genealogy of Jesus that he doesn't belong to? It's a really interesting question. One of the many interesting questions about Matthew. And, if you want a fuller exposition of this and a fuller description of the genealogy, because there are other problems in this genealogy of Matthew, I have this course on my, if you look at on my webpage, bartehrman.com, I have a course on the Gospel of Matthew, an 8-lecture course where I devote a lot of time explaining the problems of this genealogy and trying to explain them all. But for here, Jacob's asking about the textual variant, an interesting textual variant. I think this one's pretty interesting because that last line is changed in some manuscripts. So the original appears to have said what this edition has, that Jacob was the father of Joseph. So Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, from whom was born Jesus, the one who's called the Christ. Okay, so Jesus is born of Mary. But you have changes. In one manuscript, for example, or several manuscripts, you have this. Jacob begot Joseph, to whom was betrothed the Virgin Mary. To whom, being betrothed, the Virgin Mary begot Jesus, the one who is called the Christ. So this emphasizes that Jesus is not related to Joseph because she's a virgin. And so like it's emphasizing that in the genealogy, which more or less, intensifies the problem. Except that it would intensify, except when it says this, it actually has Joseph as the subject of the verb. So it says, being betrothed to whom Joseph begot Jesus, the one who's called the Christ. Wait a second. What? And so, right. So it tends to be a little bit confusing. But in that change, probably made, I don't know, somebody wasn't paying attention. It turns out Joseph was the father. And it certainly solved the problem of the genealogy. So anyway, yeah.
I'd like to circle back to Mark. In Mark 1:1, you note that there is a variance there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. This is one that's much more debated because it's a complicated issue. Actually, this one's a particularly complicated issue. So Mark begins his gospel differently. There's no genealogy. There's no birth narrative. Mark begins by saying the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's the way it's found in this earlier edition of the Nestle Aland. What I just read is a translation, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. But they put the term Son of God in brackets. Why do they put it in brackets? They put it in brackets because they're not sure those two words were originally there. There are some manuscripts that begin by saying the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, period. Then they go on to talk about the appearance of John the Baptist and Jesus being baptized. Now, I pointed out that we've got some manuscripts of Luke that have Jesus being baptized, and it looks like in the original text of Luke, God makes Jesus his son at the baptism. In Mark, the voice of the baptism is, "You are my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased." That comes later. In this verse, though, the question is, did it originally say Son of God at the beginning or not? Many scholars have taken this verse, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, to be the actual title of this book. That Mark wrote that line not as the first verse, but as the title. You don't have verse numbers in the old manuscripts, of course, and Mark didn't have verse numbers; those are added much later. So the beginning. So is it the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, or the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God? Why does it matter? It's the same thing, right? Yeah, well, kind of. And in fact, in the Gospel of Mark, there's a large emphasis on Jesus being the Son of God. Big emphasis in Mark on Jesus being the Son of God. The term Son of God for Jesus is not used very often in Mark. It's not used often, but it's used in the key places. It occurs at the baptism. First thing Jesus does, he gets baptized. The voice says, "You are my beloved son." It occurs at the transfiguration. Jesus almost exactly halfway through the gospel, Jesus goes up on the Mount of Transfiguration, and he's transfigured before the disciples, and the voice comes from heaven and again says, "This is my son." It comes a third time when Jesus is crucified. This time, it's not the voice of God. This time, it's the centurion who's just crucified Jesus, who sees how Jesus died. He apparently sees that the curtain in the temple has been ripped. He sees how Jesus has died, and the centurion says, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." So it happens at the beginning, the middle, and the end. And so, kind of the point is Jesus is the Son of God. So there would be nothing weird about Mark beginning his gospel, the first verse, by saying the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That wouldn't be that unusual, but why is it missing from manuscripts? Did scribes actually take it out? Why would a scribe take it out if it fits perfectly in Mark? Would a scribe have added it? Well, there's actually a reason for thinking they might have added it. I will say that a number of scholars, it's hard for me to do this without a whiteboard. I'm not going to try my whiteboard here, but it's a little hard for me to do this. But a number of scholars think that the words were taken out by accident. And the reason is this sentence, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words here. Tu euangeliou Iesu Christou huiou theou. They all 5 end in the letters in English OU, omicron, upsilon in Greek. So they all end that same way. So the name Jesus Christ is spelled out here. The word Son of God is spelled out here. But in ancient manuscripts, they would have likely abbreviated these words, because these are among those words that scribes typically abbreviated. Words that, like Jesus and Christ and God and Son and David, and there are a group of about 15 words that scribes would abbreviate, because they appeared so much that they just abbreviate them with a little line over the top to tell you it's an abbreviation. But if that's the case, then the words would have been abbreviated, and they would have, so instead of Iesu Christou huiou theou, it'd be like just a few letters instead of like the entire words. The theory that scholars have is that scribes wrote Iesu Christou with abbreviations and wrote the omicron upsilon, the OU at the end of Christou. Their eye went back to the page and they landed on the omicron upsilon, the OU at the end of theou. And it's just a few letters. And so their eye skipped from a few letters to the next few letters, and they thought those were the words they had copied, and they didn't. So they went to the next word. They left out these 2 words. Okay. These words ended the same way. And so this is a case of what scholars call homoioteliuton, words ending the same way. And so you just accidentally leave out some words because when your eye goes back to the word you just copied, you go to the end of the word and you think you just got, okay. So that's a possibility. I don't think it's plausible. I don't think this, usually scribes do that when they're kind of tired, and they just make mistakes because they've been copying all day and they're tired. But you begin a gospel like, you're fresh and alert. You start right in when you start a new gospel. So, it seems unlikely that within the first 6 words, the first 7 words, they were so tired they missed a couple. So I don't think it's done accidentally. If it's done on purpose, I can't see any reason for somebody to take the words out, Son of God, but I can see a reason for somebody adding the word Son of God. The reason for adding them is precisely what I said before. There are some Christian groups who think that Jesus became the Son of God at the baptism. That's when he became the Son of God, and he was the Son of God at the end until he became the Son of God, and then the Son of God, then Christ left him at the end, so that the Gnostic view. Gnostics liked the Gospel of Mark, especially because of the ending. My God, why have you left me behind? But this Gnostic view is dependent on Christ becoming the Son of God at the baptism. Why would scribes add the phrase Son of God to the first verse before the baptism? Because then it becomes clear that Jesus is the Son of God all the way through, not starting with the baptism. And so what I argue in my book, it's a long argument, it gets a bit in the weeds, but what I argue is scribes added the phrase Son of God in order to counter a Gnostic reading of the Gospel of Mark.
Did that addition also happen sometime in the second or third centuries, like with that other variant we discussed earlier?
Probably. It appears to be quoted this way in the writings of Irenaeus, who is writing in the 180s of the Common Era. So it appears that he knew of a manuscript that was missing. We only have a few manuscripts that are missing it. One of the manuscripts, make sure I get this right. Yeah, one of the manuscripts that is missing it is a very fine 4th century manuscript, the Codex Sinaiticus. So, but is also, as I said, it appears to be unknown to Irenaeus, and shortly after Irenaeus to Origen, a church father in the early 3rd century.
So based on what you said about the modifications that were done to the Gospel of Luke, did the original Gospel of Luke did it not have a virgin birth story? Was that added later to counter the idea that Jesus became the Son of God at the baptism?
Now, this is a really difficult question, and it's going to take me a while. If you don't mind, Jacob, do you mind if I take a while on this one?
Please, go ahead.
Because this is tricky. This now is dealing with a different situation, because all of our manuscripts have Luke chapters 1 and 2. These are the account of Jesus' virgin birth to Mary in Bethlehem. Joseph and Mary are betrothed. They're not married yet, but there's a worldwide census, and they have to go to Bethlehem to register for the census, because Joseph comes from the lineage of King David, who was from Bethlehem. And so he has to go register for the census in Bethlehem, and he and Mary go to Bethlehem. And while she's there, she goes into labor. She's 9 months pregnant or whatever. She goes into labor and she gives birth. And so Jesus is born in Bethlehem. So that's chapter 2 of Luke. Chapter 1 of Luke is actually about the prediction of the birth of John the Baptist, and the birth of John the Baptist, and prediction of the birth of Jesus, and then you get this thing in chapter 2. So you got 1 and 2, a very long 2 chapters dealing with the first the birth of John the Baptist, but mainly the birth of Jesus. These are in all the manuscripts. They're not missing from any manuscript. And so what we're talking about now is not a textual variant. A textual variant is a different reading found in different manuscripts. In this case, chapters 1 and 2 are in all the manuscripts. And so the issue does not involve manuscripts differing from each other. But there are reasons for thinking in this case that the passage missing in Luke, the passage, Luke chapters 1 and 2, were originally not in Luke, even though they're in all the manuscripts. So it's a long, complicated argument. I'm going to be talking about it. I've got another course coming up in November on the Gospel of Luke. That's kind of like my Matthew course, only it's about Luke, in which I'll be talking about this at some length. And I've talked about it on my blog a number of times. If you know about my blog, you can go and find it there. But I agree with those scholars who think that Luke 1 and 2 were not original. Let me give you just several of the reasons for thinking so. First, the writing style of Luke chapters 1 and 2 is very different from what you find in the rest of Luke's gospel. It reads much more like the biblical accounts that you find in the Old Testament. The writing style is more like the Greek Old Testament than anything that shows up in chapter 3 of Luke and following. So that doesn't mean anything much, but it's worth noting anyway. Second thing to note is the way chapter 3 of Luke begins sounds like it's beginning a brand new book. It sounds like the start of a book. It's dating the events that are going to take place. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene, in the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John. And so John, the son of Zechariah. And so it sure sounds like he's beginning a book, because you begin a book by dating when the events are going to take place. Well, why would you do that here if already you've got 2 chapters to kind of set it up? So that's a little bit odd. Again, it's not completely completely out of order, but it is worth noting. But there are other things to talk about. One is that the idea of the virgin birth is not mentioned anywhere else in Luke or in the book of Acts. The book of Acts is written by the same author as the Gospel of Luke. It's written as the second volume of Luke, and it describes the spread of Christianity throughout the Roman world after Jesus' resurrection and ascension. So, okay, that's fine. But the book of Acts sometimes refers back to Luke. And when it does, it summarizes what happened in Luke by talking about the things Jesus said and did. It doesn't say anything about Jesus being born of a virgin in its summaries. And in fact, so virgin birth is never mentioned in Acts. None of the apostles who preached to convert people says anything about the virgin birth. So you have that. You also have the fact that Jesus is never portrayed as somebody who, so he's never portrayed as somebody who came from a virgin in the rest of the book. Jesus, throughout the book, seems to be thought of, in the book of Acts, seems to be thought of as somebody who became the Son of God at the baptism. And in fact, in Luke 3:22, as we've talked about, it appears that Jesus did become the Son of God at the baptism. And so if he became the Son of God at the baptism, how could he be born the Son of God to a virgin? You see, so you start mounting up these various arguments, and they all point in the same direction. And so there are other arguments that I give in my stuff. I don't need to go into them here, but I will say that for these reasons, there are a number of scholars who think that, in fact, these 2 chapters were added to Luke before any of our manuscripts were produced. And so they're a secondary addition to Luke. So Luke originally began with chapter 3, verse 15. And that's why later there's no word about the virgin birth, no word about Bethlehem, no word about the census, nothing about Joseph. It's all because that stuff was added later. Why would it be added later? Why would you have somebody add Luke chapters 1 and 2? Well, for one thing, you've got the virgin birth now, so it's not just found in Matthew. This virgin birth story wasn't taken from Matthew because the stories are completely different, but it achieves the end of showing that Jesus was actually the Son of God from his birth. against Gnostics who would say, no, actually it happened at his baptism. And so it could serve some value there. It's valuable as well because it makes very clear connections to the Old Testament, linking Jesus to prophets of the Old Testament and to prophecy in the Old Testament, which furthers the Orthodox cause against those Christians in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries who were saying that, in fact, the Old Testament is not a Christian book and that Jesus is not related to the Old Testament. Well, now he is, based on these chapters, and so on. So there are lots of reasons for thinking these chapters were added to Luke, but added before any of our surviving manuscripts. Another thing to point out, an interesting point, is that church fathers roundly attacked a 2nd century heretic named Marcion because he had a view of God and Christ and salvation that they didn't agree with, and he had some kind of form of the Gospel of Luke. He had some form of the Gospel of Luke that is not like our Gospel of Luke. We know this because church fathers talk about it, and one of the things they say about it is that Marcion's version of the Gospel of Luke did not have chapters 1 and 2. What they maintain is that that Marcion cut out those chapters, that he sliced them out of his copy of Luke. But given everything else, it may be that Marcion simply knows a different form of Luke, one that did not have a birth narrative.
So, did the redactor, whoever that person was that added the first 2 chapters to Luke, could that person have possibly have known Matthew and maybe didn't like Matthew's infancy story, didn't like Matthew's genealogy, and as a response used Luke, which in a sense served as an empty vessel because it didn't have that stuff, to create different stuff to contradict Matthew? Or is even those 2 chapters that were added later to Luke in of itself independent of Matthew, as Luke's original text was?
I don't think there's anything to suggest that the author of Luke 1 and 2 modeled his stories about the virgin birth on Matthew. And it's largely because the only things they have in common are the very, very broad themes, which anybody talking about Jesus' virgin birth would be familiar with. And so his mother Mary is a virgin. She's betrothed to someone named Joseph. So they've obviously never had sex. He's born in Bethlehem, but he ends up in Nazareth. So they have that, but every story is different. They have lots of different stories in the 2. The stories in Matthew, for example, about the Magi or Herod killing the children, not found in Luke. And so he doesn't take over some stories, and the themes that he takes over, he presents differently. So the reason Jesus is born in Bethlehem, but ends up in Nazareth, is completely different between Matthew and Luke. In Matthew, the way it happens is there's not a census that takes them to Bethlehem to register. In Matthew, they're from Bethlehem. Apparently, Joseph and Mary live in Bethlehem. They have to move out of Bethlehem because the king is out to kill the child, and they have to get out of there. And so they end up in Nazareth. And so virtually everything's different. And so it's kind of like this: when you, if today you get 2 people telling the same story, and suppose they're telling the same story about some event that happened in New York City last weekend, and say there was a pride parade or something, and they say, oh, there's pride parade, and it went down Madison Avenue, and there were some protesters by the side waving signs, but it all came out okay. So but they have lots of stories telling it, they take each of them takes 5 pages to tell that story, but they got those things in common. How would you know whether one of them used the other for its source? The fact they have some the basic commonalities the same doesn't show it, because you'll have news stories commonly having the same thing. So what you look for, you say, well, okay, is there any evidence that this one used that one? Well, what do you look for? What you look for example, are verbatim agreements. Like, suppose you've got a sentence, like some sentence on some random thing in this one, and it's the same sentence about the same random thing in this one. Like, if it's word for word the same, you're saying, wait a second, how'd that happen? And like, you got a couple more instances of that, and you say, man, this is plagiarism. That's how you detect plagiarism, is when you have verbatim agreements. If you have broad thematic similarities, it doesn't make somebody copying somebody. I don't think you've got that kind of agreement between Matthew and Luke in these chapters. And so I think I think the burden of proof would be on somebody who says, well, yeah, Luke got it from Matthew. And you'd have to have some good arguments. And all you have are these basic themes. And so I don't think there's much of a way to mount a case.
All right. When exactly was the woman caught up in adultery added to the Gospel of John? Is it really the case that it wasn't even in there until around 500 CE?
So let me look up my trusty apparatus so I make sure I don't get this wrong. Where we go. So what used to be said, I actually wrote an article on this many years ago, where just about everybody except for fundamentalists agrees that this passage was not original. It's missing. It is so widely missing. Let me just tell you the date, and then I'll tell you about my article. So, where did it go? Okay. So the first time it is added here, sorry. When is the first time it's added? It looks like it's added by different manuscripts, obviously, at different times. But the first time it looks like it's added is in around the year 400 in Codex Bezae in a manuscript. So around the year 400. Before that, we have a number of witnesses that are lacking it. And so there are lots of reasons for thinking it wasn't original that are not just about the manuscripts. For one thing, the writing style changes pretty interestingly right after. But the writing style before this is a kind of a consistent writing style. This story is a different writing style. And then right after this story, you have the same writing style. And so you have to examine that in the Greek, looking at detail. But that's pretty much agreed by everybody. There are things in this passage that don't really work very well in the context. So people look at that. So there are a range of things about that. So the answer to your question is it first shows up in Codex Bezae around the year 400. I wrote an article on this thing once that argued I dealt with two arguments. One thing is that when people point out that this thing appears like it was not original, they always say, or typically they say, that there's no Greek commentator on the Gospel of John that mentions this until the 12th century. And yeah, well, that's actually right. And people writing commentaries on the Gospel of John don't mention it to the 12th century. And it's often thought, you don't really have much evidence of this before that in any church father. When I was doing my dissertation on Didymus the Blind, a 4th century church father, I found a passage where he actually summarizes this text. And he's living in the 4th century. And so I wrote an article showing that this was actually, it appears that a form of this story was already known to Didymus the Blind in the 4th century. But it's not an early edition, and it's so, there's so many arguments against it that even when I was an evangelical Christian, I knew this thing wasn't original. And that's the consensus, really.
All right, let's take some super chat questions. Michael E, thank you for your super chat. Thoughts on Christian atheism from Slavoj Zizek or Thomas Altizer, like Hegel? They argue God dies on the cross, remaining is the Holy Spirit, an egalitarian collective of believers bound by love.
I would say those are theological views. I'm not a theologian. And so, even though they're atheistic views, they do have, they're dealing with kind of an interpretation of the text that's trying to make it meaningful in a kind of a religious sense. And so, so it kind of depends what one means. I mean, they're not doing an analysis, like an interpretive analysis of any of the individual gospels when they say things like that. They're thinking in kind of broader philosophical terms. And so it's their way of making sense of these passages philosophically. Just as an example, to say that the Holy Spirit is an egalitarian collective of believers bound by love, that could be a very powerful thought, that the Holy Spirit isn't some entity, a member of the divine Trinity that is doing things here among us, but in fact, it represents a kind of a natural thing that the believers in Christ now are bound together by their faith and their love, and they form a community, and that's the manifestation of the Holy Spirit. That would certainly fit in with a Hegelian philosophy where there isn't any real spirit. In the theological sense, but it's not an exegesis of these passages. For me, I'm far more interested in what these passages are saying, and I'm not trying to redeem them for any modern theological or philosophical purpose. I'm interested in what Mark has to say about the death of Jesus, what Luke has to say about the death of Jesus. I'm interested in how those interpretations might have relevance for people today. But I don't have the agenda of systematic theology, which is trying to take the biblical message and come up with a kind of a coherent, unified message that could be important to Christians today. These philosophers are following in the steps of those systematic theologians who have been around forever, who are trying to come up with kind of a unified message of philosophical importance. And I'm not against that endeavor at all. It's not something that I'm particularly engaged in. And it is, of course, it's in terms of a historical phenomenon, it's interesting that people like Zizek and others have gotten interested in this kind of analysis. But that's culturally and intellectually interesting, but it's not something I have really any way of commenting on.
Hard work. Thank you for your super chat. Can Dr. Ehrman please explain his opinion on the coherence-based geological method? And he corrected a misspelling here. He says autocorrect changed my text. So
genealogical.
Chat should be genealogical.
Yeah, genealogical method. Yeah. Right. Okay. So earlier, Jacob, when you asked me about family groups, I described what you were asking me about, which is how traditionally scholars have collected manuscripts into groups and evaluated which groups are superior to other groups to help them decide which texts are original. About, I don't know how long ago now, 20 years, 25 years ago or so, out of this group in Munster that I mentioned that is producing this new edition of the Nestle-Aland text, the Nestle-Aland 29th, out of that group, especially one scholar in the group, Gert Mink, devised a method that's called the coherence-based genealogical method. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs, for which you can thank me. It would take a long time and it's very detailed. But what I will say is this is a method that tries to get rid of the need to group manuscripts. It does not think that it's useful to talk about an Alexandrian text, a Byzantine text, a Western text, a Caesarean text. They don't think that that's useful and that it's outdated. And now with computer technology, we don't have to do that. What the coherence-based genealogical method does, in short, is it tries to understand the genealogical relationship not of manuscripts, but of variant readings. And the way it does it is it takes any reading or it's different. So suppose you've got a verse and you've got like 3 words that are worded differently in some manuscripts than others, that are like a unit, a sense unit of 3 words. It's different here, different there, maybe different there. What they do is they come up, they list all the variants and they have all which manuscripts have which variants. And then they try to figure out which of these variant readings probably came from the other readings based on a computer analysis, based on the data that they feed into the computer. And the computer chunks it out so that you can show where these readings, how these readings related to each other genealogically, which one first came to the next, and which one's influenced by which one, and which one that. And you do that for each variant reading, but then you feed all the data into a computer, and it establishes the coherence of the entire tradition for that book, showing which readings are the oldest readings, and which readings came from those oldest readings. And so it's a computerized model that would have been impossible before now. It is ignoring the it's in my judgment, it is somewhat ignoring. People will object to this, but who know the method, it's somewhat ignoring. It is ignoring what the original text was. It's trying to find what the originating variant was that originated all the other manuscripts, but it doesn't ask the question, was that what the author originally wrote? The method can't solve that. And so it's, in a sense, it's leaving behind some of the evidence that I think is important, which is trying to figure out which of the variant readings that survive pass the criteria of which one is more likely for this particular author to have written based on a number of considerations. So it is the order of the day. It's how people are proceeding. I don't find the results to be significant so far, even though they claim that they're really highly significant. But when you look at the results, for me, they don't add up to a lot. But I will admit I'm out of the field now. I'm not doing textual criticism now. I haven't been doing textual criticism for really 15 or 20 years now. And so so to that extent, I'm not the best person probably to ask about it, but I have not been overwhelmed by the results, and I have serious doubts about the method, but I'm a dinosaur in the field. And so, what I say doesn't really have much effect on anything. I think the most interesting part of textual criticism is deciding what an author wrote and why somebody changed it. For me, that's detective work. And I also think it's really interesting to figure out why scribes are changing texts. That's a historical question that you can't solve with a computer. The things that I'm most interested in, mounting arguments for which variant reading is older than others and why you had changes. You've got to mount historical and literary arguments for that. And I think people who practice the coherence-based genealogical method just don't do that, in my experience. I will get some people complaining to me about this.
Let's get to the next super chat. Swords to Plowshares. Thank you for your super chat. Are there any other differences between manuscripts of Mark with the added ending and those without it, i.e. missing parables, pericope, etc.?
Yes, there are thousands and thousands of differences between the manuscripts, whether they have the ending or not. Those who have the ending have differences among them. Those who don't have the ending have differences among them, but they don't have other large-scale omissions. And so it's not the kind of situation that you might hope for, where you had a bunch of manuscripts that lack the ending and also are missing this parable, and they're missing this healing story, and they all have that in common. It's not like that. It's just that most manuscripts have the ending. The few that don't have the ending don't have other large chunks missing. They still have lots of disagreements among them.
The next one, Terry Truster. Thank you for your super chat. The Essenes believed in spiritual resurrection. First century Judaism wasn't a monolith. Disciplines had Essene theology. Why do you say they didn't believe in spiritual resurrection when they did?
I think it means disciples had an Essene ideology.
Yeah.
I don't think the disciples had an Essene ideology. I think that Jesus and the Essenes had a similar ideology in the sense that they were apocalyptic, as were other Jewish groups. I think the idea that the Essenes believed in a spiritual resurrection is coming from Josephus, and I don't think historically that it's right. I don't think the Essenes did believe in a spiritual resurrection. They believed they had a very physical understanding of the apocalypse with an apocalyptic worldview, as did other Jews who believed in resurrection. There were some Jews who did not believe in resurrection. The one that we know of are the Sadducees. But it's not because they believed in a spiritual resurrection. It's because they didn't believe in an afterlife. They thought you died, that's the end of the story. That's the view found throughout the Hebrew Bible. It's the Old Testament view. And the Sadducees had that view. The Pharisees believed in a resurrection. The Essenes believed in resurrection. Followers of Jesus believed in resurrection. John the Baptist believed in resurrection. Paul believed in resurrection. These are all apocalyptic Jews. So in all those cases, I think you can show that they subscribe to the idea of a physical resurrection. When Jesus says that at the resurrection there'll be no marriage nor giving in marriage, he's talking about physical union in marriage. And so it's clear that he's not, spirits, bodies marry, people marry. And so I think he's clearly talking about a physical resurrection in contrast to the Sadducees whom he's answering. So I don't think Josephus's descriptions of the four philosophical schools are particularly accurate. At least they don't seem to coincide with what we have from other evidence.
All right. Mr. Warlight, thank you for your super chat. Luke and Matthew have different blessed be the poor parts in the Sermon on the Mount. Which version was written first? Did Luke copy an earlier sermon?
So Matthew and Luke both have the Beatitudes, but they have them in different forms and in different places in their Gospels. The parts they have are often word for word the same. So they both have blessed are the poor, but Matthew has blessed are the poor in spirit. And Luke has blessed are you poor. Matthew has blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Luke has blessed are you who hunger and thirst. There's obviously a difference between hungering for righteousness and being hungry. Luke seems to be emphasizing more of a social agenda, concern for those who are poor, concern for those who are hungry, and throughout his gospel, concern for those who are outcast, concern for women who didn't have as high of a status as men in that world. Luke has these kinds of social agenda. This question is particularly, though, about the Beatitudes. The question is, why in these Beatitudes and in other parts of Matthew and Luke, for example, the Lord's Prayer, their prayers differ in some ways. Matthew's is longer, and there's some words that are different, but they have a lot of words that are just the same. Or you'll have parables that are virtually the same, or other sayings virtually the same. How's that work? Why is that? So scholars have long debated this, but since the 19th century, the consensus among scholars, it's not an overwhelming consensus now because there are people who have different opinions, but still the majority view among scholars, so far as I can tell, is that Matthew and Luke have these passages in common because they are copying a common source. It does not look like Luke copied Matthew or that Matthew copied Luke. The reason for thinking that is because these passages they have in common, where they've got word for words the same, those are the passages in Matthew and Luke that are in different sequences in Matthew and Luke. When Matthew and Luke also have word for word agreements that are found in Mark, in other words, they've both copied Mark. So you get a passage in Mark, Matthew copies it, Luke copies it. So sometimes all three will have the same wording. Sometimes Matthew and Mark will have the same wording, but Luke will have something different. Sometimes Mark and Luke will have something the same thing, Matthew will have it different. You get these various combinations. But these passages show that there's copying going on because they're verbatim agreements. And since all three have them in common, you can compare all three and you can work it out that Mark appears to have been copied by Matthew and Luke. When you have those passages where Matthew and Luke, Matthew copied Mark, Luke copied Mark, we have those in common. Matthew and Luke generally have these passages in the same sequence. When Matthew and Luke have word for word agreements in passages not in Mark, they're almost always sayings. They're in different sequences. If Luke was copying Matthew, then you would think that he'd at least keep some of the same sequences for the materials in Matthew, because Luke does keep the same sequence for the material from Mark. So that shows that probably Matthew and Luke are not copying each other. So they probably caught it from a common source, and the common source is usually called Q. Q is it's short for the German word Quelle. Scholars who invented this were German scholars. They didn't invent Q. They invented the idea of Q. They came up with the idea that Matthew and Luke had a common source for their sayings. So it's called the sayings source. And so it's the sayings Quelle. So they just call it Q for the saying source, Q, because Quelle starts with a Q, Quelle. So Luke probably was copying Q at this point, making some changes possibly. Matthew's copying Q at this point, making some changes probably. So yes, Luke was copying some other source probably. Which wording is the oldest? Did Jesus originally say, blessed are the poor in spirit? Or did he say, blessed are the poor? Scholars will go back and forth on this. I think the majority view continues to be that when you have those kinds of differences, more often Luke is presenting the older form. And that's what I think. I think Luke is presenting Jesus' social agenda because Luke agrees with Jesus' social agenda that you should take care of the poor and you take care of the hungry. And Matthew has more of a kind of a spiritualized view of it. What matters isn't poverty. What matters is being poor in spirit. In other words, humble or meek. What matters is not hungering and thirsting. Well, why does that matter? What matters is you hunger and thirst for righteousness. It's more of a spiritual teaching. So I think Luke has the older version, probably the one that was in Q. Matthew's changed it, not because he changed Luke, but because he changed Q.
What is Mr. World? I figure for you, super chat. What is the relation between the Ebionite Gospel and Mark, since both have the same elements, beginning with the baptism? Was one based on the other?
So we have a Gospel of the Ebionites that's called that, and I assume this. I'm going to assume that Mr. Warlight is talking about that, because sometimes people. He may be talking about something else, because sometimes when people say the Ebionite gospel, what they mean is like a Jewish Christian gospel that is talked about, that is kind of this like amalgamation of things from church fathers, and you just call it the Ebionite gospel. We actually have a book called The Gospel According to the Ebionites. And so I'm going to assume he's talking about that. That gospel we have only in quotations from church fathers. We don't have a thing. We don't have like a manuscript of this gospel. In fact, it's not church fathers. It's a church father. A 4th century church father named Epiphanius quotes a gospel that he says is the gospel of the Ebionites. The Ebionites was one of the Jewish Christian groups in the early church. They appear to have had a gospel, as did other Jewish Christian groups. One of the things that's most interesting about this gospel of the Ebionites is that it appears to have been a gospel that was harmonizing other gospel texts. By harmonizing, I mean, how sometimes you'll have a different story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. One way to harmonize that is to take Matthew, Mark, Luke's version of the story and to combine them into one big story, where all the elements of Matthew and all the elements in Mark and all the elements of Luke are in one account. People do this mentally all the time. So when people talk about the 7 last words of the dying Jesus, you may have heard of that. What are Jesus' 7 last words? And so he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. They're saying, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He says, Father, into your hands I've committed my spirit. And he says all of these things. He doesn't say all those things in any of the Gospels. In Matthew, he says a couple of these things, and Mark, he says one of those things, and Luke, he says a few of these things. And so you take them all and you smash them together, and then you get the 7 last words of the dying Jesus. And you could call that like the American gospel or something. I don't know. But so the Ebionite, the gospel of the Ebionites, though, appears to have been an actual gospel that did something similar. It put the stories together. And the reason for thinking of that is one of the reasons for thinking it, the best reason for thinking of it, is because when Epiphanius quotes this gospel, he quotes its account of the birth of the baptism. And so probably this gospel, as this questioner said, does start with the baptism narrative. I pointed out earlier that in Mark's gospel, the voice from heaven says, "You are my beloved son, in whom I'm well pleased." I also pointed out that in Matthew's gospel, it says, "This is my beloved son, in whom I'm well pleased." And you think, well, who cares? Well, actually, there's a difference. Because in Mark's account, the voice is coming only to Jesus. No one else is said to hear the voice. That's interesting because throughout Mark's gospel, one of the leading themes is that nobody can figure out how Jesus can be the Son of God. And at the baptism, nobody's told it, just Jesus. In Matthew's gospel, people have no problem figuring out who Jesus is, more commonly. And the voice doesn't come to Jesus, it comes to the crowds. "This is my beloved son," or possibly just to John the Baptist. "This is my beloved son." God's telling someone else, not telling Jesus. Okay? But then you get to Luke, and as I pointed out in Luke, it looks like the voice originally in the oldest form of Luke, it looks like the voice said, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." Well, how do you reconcile that? What did the voice actually say? In the Gospel of the Ebionites, as Epiphanius quotes it, the three accounts are reconciled. Because in that account, the voice comes 3 times. And so what happens in that account is, Epiphanius quotes it, and he just quotes the passage, and he says, according to the Gospel of the Ebionites, the voice came from heaven and said to Jesus, "You are my beloved son, in whom I'm well pleased." And later, the voice came and spoke to the crowd, "This is my beloved son, in whom I'm well pleased." So first spoke what Mark said, then said what Matthew said, and then John the Baptist asked something about, like, how can this be the Son of God? And the voice then comes a third time, says, "You are my beloved son, today I have begotten you." And so the voice comes 3 times in this gospel. And so it's so it does look like the Gospel of the Ebionites did begin with a baptism scene. It appears that he did know the Gospel of Mark, but it appears that he also knew Matthew and Luke. And he tried to combine these into one complementary account where you don't have differences among the Gospels. You got one Gospel that's coherent. Many people listening to this will realize that is similar to what happened in the 2nd century at the hands of a more famous Christian author who took the 4 Gospels and he combined them into one Gospel. So it's a church father named Tatian, who was a disciple of Justin, martyr, whom I mentioned earlier, around the year 150. He went to Rome. He was from Syria. He went to Rome, and even though he was from Syria, and he learned Greek, but at some point he composed a gospel that was the 4 Gospels put together into one big gospel that was a kind of a gospel harmony. And that big gospel of Tatian's is called the Diatessaron. Dia means through. Tessaron means 4, through the 4. This is the one gospel that comes through the 4 Gospels. This became the gospel that was widely used in Syria for centuries. They did not use Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John separately from them, and they actually called those the separate Gospels, but they used the Diatessaron. And it is much to our regret that we no longer have a copy of the Diatessaron. One of the hardest parts of New Testament studies in textual criticism, one of the most difficult tasks, is trying to figure out what the Diatessaron looked like, how it was worded. And there have been big disputes about that, even over the last 30 years, the entire sea change about how people go about doing that. But it is incredibly difficult. You've got to know all these other languages. It's really hard. But it would be an account of a gospel harmony that was like the Gospel of the Ebionites in its intent in many ways, but it could not have been the Gospel of the Ebionites. It had to be a different gospel for reasons I don't need to go into. But so there were gospel harmonies like that. And so that was the Gospel of the Ebionites.
When was Luke 22:43 to 44 added?
Okay, back to the text. So Luke 22:43 through 44 was the first passage that I devoted a piece of scholarship to. And so it's always been an important text for me. When I was a graduate student, I think it was my first year in my graduate program, a friend of mine and I started collaborating about this passage, and we ended up writing a scholarly article on it, and it's the first scholarly article that I produced in conjunction with this other fellow. This is named Mark Plunkett. The passage is about Jesus praying before he's arrested. So he has his Last Supper. Judas goes out to get the soldiers to come arrest Jesus, and so I'm going to tell you what's in this passage. Jesus goes out and he goes to the Mount of Olives. His disciples are following him. He comes to the place where he wants to be, Mount of Olives, and he tells them, "Pray that you not enter into temptation." Then he leaves them, goes about a stone's throw away, and he kneels down and he prays, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know." Father, I'm sorry. "Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will be done." And then we're told that Jesus came to be in deep agony and began sweating as if like drops of blood dropping from his head to the ground, and an angel came and comforted him. Then he arose from prayer and came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to them, "Why do you sleep? Rise and pray that you not enter into temptation." So it begins and ends with that same injunction: pray that you not enter into temptation. The two of those verses that I just quoted are not in some of our manuscripts. It's called the passage of the bloody sweat. You know, today people talk about sweating blood. I think it comes from these verses. Jesus begins to sweat drops as if of blood, and an angel comes to comfort him. He's in deep agony. So it's chapter 22, verses 43 to 44 of Luke. And the question is, did these two verses originally belong to Luke? The verses that say that he starts sweating as if blood and he's comforted by an angel. They're missing from our oldest and best manuscripts, but they're found in other very good and early manuscripts. And so, which is it? Were they originally there or not? Well, it kind of depends on which manuscripts you read. The manuscripts are divided, but there are good reasons based on the writings of the church fathers that both forms of the text were known early. They got changed probably in the second Christian century. The first time they get quoted, those verses get quoted, is in the writings of Justin Martyr again. And they get quoted by two other church fathers living a few decades later. So whether they were in there or not, they're omitted in an early manuscript. They're found in early church fathers. And so the change came sometime in the second century. So the question is, did scribes add those verses or did scribes take them out? That's the question. It is hotly debated among scholars. There continue to be dispute, but I am absolutely convinced of my view of this, which goes back to, whenever I was doing this in 1982 or something. And I wrote up a long discussion of it in my book, O Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. And I wrote up a shorter description in my book, Misquoting Jesus, where I try to show that originally these verses were missing from the text. That they weren't there. They're not original. I have a number of arguments for this. Some of them have to do with the manuscripts. Some of them have to do with the coherence of the passage. If you take those verses out, the passage is very interesting because it formed. Okay, why not? I'll tell you what. The stylistic argument. This is the one my friend came up with. Is that without these verses, they form a chiasmus. So the way a chiasmus is a Greek rhetorical form, and the way it works is you got a passage, and it says this, and this. Okay, but you start looking at it closely, and the beginning thing that it says is just like the last thing it says. And the second thing is a lot like the second to last thing. And the third thing is a lot like the third to last thing. And so like it goes from A to B to C, and then it goes from then you've got something like C, you call it C1, something B1 and A1. And it's called a chiasmus because it looks like an X, which X is the letter chi in Greek. And so it's called a chiasmus. So the point of a chiasmus is to make a literary argument, and you've got the beginning, you get 1, 2, you get A, B, C, and then if you got a D, the D is in the very middle, and there's no D1. It goes then it goes from D to C1, B1, A1. Okay, you see that? And so without those verses, you have this perfect chiasmus. And I don't believe in chiasmus as much. I don't think they hardly ever occur, but I think this one is. So Jesus, it begins with Jesus telling the disciples, pray that you not enter into temptation. It ends with Jesus praying that you not enter into temptation. He leaves them. He returns to them. He kneels down. He gets up. And in the middle of that thing is his prayer, Father, take away this cup from me. But your will be done, not mine. The center of this thing is this prayer to God. Okay? It begins with saying, pray so you not enter into temptation. It ends with pray you not enter into temptation. What do? Do they pray? No. We're told in the next verse they'd fallen asleep. They don't pray. What happens next? The soldiers come and arrest Jesus. What do those who were told to pray that you not enter into temptation do when the soldiers come? They flee. They get out of there. They're not willing to stand up and stay there. They enter into temptation. Jesus does not try to flee. He does not enter temptation because he's the one who prayed. It's right in the center of the chiasmus. So the chiasmus emphasizes the need to pray not to enter into temptation. The two verses that are added, he sweats blood and an angel comes and comforts him. It disrupts the chiasmus. It disrupts the order of the way it's structured. Not only that, but even more important, it introduces into Luke's account something that is completely absent otherwise. More than that, it's not just absent. Luke took this emphasis out of Mark, his source. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is really distraught going to his death. He tells his disciples in Mark that my soul is burdened unto death. He doesn't say that in Luke. Luke takes that verse out. He kneels down in deep agony in Mark. In deep agony, he's taken out in Luke. In fact, he doesn't kneel in Mark. He falls on his face. In Luke, he calmly takes his knees. Point after point where Mark is emphasizing the agony, Luke takes it out. So it doesn't make sense that if he wants to get rid of Jesus' agony, that what he puts in is his agony. And you can't say that he put it in to replace these other things because there's no reason to get rid of those other things. You keep them and this agony. And also, you don't do that because you destroyed the chiasmus. And so, anyway, so I've got this long argument that involved things like that to try and show that, in fact, these verses, the sweating, the bloody sweat, were added to Luke, were not original to Luke. And the reason they were added, this is another part of the argument, is because they show Jesus being very, very human. The three church fathers who quote this, the earliest attestations of these verses, the ones who first quote this verse, use it in order to show that Jesus was fully human in the face of other Christians who are saying Jesus was God, but he's not human. These verses show he's sweating blood. He's in agony. He is human. And so I think these verses are added because Luke had gotten rid of all the agony. And now this passage can be used to show Jesus didn't even get anxious at the end. Oh, yes, he did. Sweat and blood. And so I think it was added as a opposition against those who don't think that Jesus was fully human, was only divine.
When was the Johannine comma added?
Right. Okay. Johannine comma. I don't talk about this in my book because my book is dealing with textual alterations done in the 2nd and 3rd century for Christological reasons, and the Johannine comma was added after that. So let me tell you what the Johannine comma is. So the term comma for us means a punctuation mark. You know, you put the punctuation mark. But the reason you put that punctuation mark there is because you're saying that this group of words set off from the next group of words. A comma is actually a kind of a group of words that cohere together, but it's not a full sentence necessarily. And so the Johannine comma is an addition of a group of words, not just a word or two, but an entire group of words that have an internal sense. And it's a very famous passage because it's the only one in the New Testament, if it were in the New Testament, that explicitly affirms that affirms the doctrine of the Trinity. You can get the doctrine of the Trinity elsewhere in the New Testament by taking this verse about God being the only God, or that verse about Jesus being God, or that verse about Spirit being like Jesus and being God. And you take verse here, and then you put them together, and you can come up with a doctrine of the Trinity. But the doctrine of the Trinity is never explicitly expressed except in this disputed passage, which is not much disputed because everybody agrees it wasn't originally there. In this case, even conservative evangelical, unless you're a fundamentalist, just about everybody agrees this thing wasn't there. The doctrine of the Trinity is not simply mentioning Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit named in the New Testament. Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 and 20, baptize the converts in the names of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's not the doctrine of the Trinity. The doctrine of the Trinity is not the existence of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's their relationship to one another. It's the technical definition that God comes in three persons. There's one God, but in three distinct persons. The three persons are distinct from one another. They are not the same person. There are three distinct persons, but those three are one. So that doesn't make mathematical sense. It doesn't really make logical sense. It's not supposed to make sense, but it's the doctrine of the Trinity, that the Godhead is three persons who are distinct, but the three are one. You don't find that statement anywhere in the New Testament. It doesn't develop until the 4th century. But you have this passage called the Johannine comma. And so this is 1 John, the epistle, 1 John chapter 5. When you read chapter 5, verses 6 and 7, it says, all right, the Spirit is the witness because the Spirit is the truth. Okay, so I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. Let me start with verse 6, actually. This is he who came by water and blood, Jesus Christ, not with the water only, but with the water and the blood. And the Spirit is the witness, because the Spirit is the truth. Okay, that's the lead up. I'm not going to interpret that here. Verse 8 then. There are three witnesses: the Spirit, the water, and the blood. And the three are one. Okay, so the Spirit, the water, and blood all testify to Jesus Christ. So the three are one. But there are some witnesses that have an addition in Latin, that say, hold on, I've got to get this. Let me find my apparatus. There it is. All right. In Greek and in Latin, you have the thing where it says there are three witnesses: the Spirit, the water, and the blood. The addition to the text, the Johannine Common, says there are three witnesses in heaven: the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit. And these three are one. And there are three witnesses on earth: the Spirit, the water, and the blood. And these three are one. Wait a second. You have the addition, not just of the Spirit, water, and blood, but you have the addition of, you have three who are in heaven: the Father, the Word, and the Spirit, and these three are one. That's the statement of the Trinity. Those verses are missing from all of our early and best manuscripts. And so it is absolutely an addition to the text. They do get quoted in church fathers that may go back to the 4th century. It may have first been found in quotations of church fathers in the 4th century, the 5th century. It doesn't get added to the New Testament until a little bit later, around then, in Latin manuscripts. There are some Greek manuscripts that do contain this, but they are very late Greek manuscripts, medieval manuscripts. So it probably was a gloss on the text, kind of an explanation of the three are one: the Spirit, the water, and the blood, by somebody who wants to say that this is applicable to the doctrine of the Trinity that was emerging in the 4th century. And so they added the statement. Somebody added that as an interpretation. Somebody then stuck it in a manuscript. And so the manuscripts that were being used, the manuscripts that developed had these. And the manuscript used to translate the King James Version had the verse. And that's why English speakers are familiar with the verse, because it's found in the King James, because King James is based on later manuscripts.
So I'm going to take a couple more super chats. We're going to be missing some super chats, but we are pretty much at the end. I'll take this one real fast because there's no question here.
Very good.
No question, just thanks. Thank you, Offer. Thank you for your super chat. And the last super chat question I will take, because it's on topic, is from Hand of Omega. Thank you for your super chat. Is the longer Acts the one in the Bible? Which version is best, and what's a good translation of it?
So the longer text of Acts is found in some manuscripts, especially Codex Bezae, and it is not the one that is usually translated. There must be translations of it, but I don't know of any for a popular audience. But it's significantly different, over 7% different, longer than the 7.5% longer than the text found in most and best manuscripts. So it has additional verses here and there.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Bart Ehrman.
Okay. Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it. It's been down in the weeds a bit, but it's been fun.
Likewise. And I just want to remind everybody to check out the History Valley Amazon affiliate link to get the Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, and also to check out Bart Ehrman's course on the Orthodox Corruption of Scripture in the History Valley affiliate link, History Valley 5-card affiliate link in the description below. And I'll see everybody later. Thanks again, Bart.
Okay. Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.